Bedtime Reading. Wuthering Heights. Book 1. A House of Hatred. Chapter 1. A Strange Night. In the winter of 1801, I first visited the large, lonely house called Wuthering Heights. It was at that time that I met the strange and angry man who I will remember until I die. That year I moved to Yorkshire, a county of England. I lived in a fine old house which was named Thrushcross Grange. I had written to a man named Heathcliff and asked to rent the house from him. He was my only neighbor in all that country. When I had been at the house for about a week, I decided to walk across the moor and visit him. It was a cold afternoon in winter when I began to walk. Fog hung in the trees, and in the distance, large, sharp, tall rocks called the Penistone Crags rose up out of the ground. I had to walk almost 4 miles through the grass and mud before I saw Wuthering Heights, the house where Heathcliff lived. It stood on the top of a hill. Around the house was a circle of short, dark trees. The house was long and low and made of gray stone. It had narrow windows in the walls. The ground was hard because of the winter frost. The air was cold as I walked towards the house. I arrived at the gate of the house's garden. It was beginning to snow, and the snowflakes were blinding my eyes. I could not see, but I put my hand on the gate. Suddenly I stopped with a look of surprise. A man was there, leaning on the gate. He stared at me with his cold, dark eyes. He seemed as gloomy and silent as the gravestones in the churchyard at the foot of the hill. He straightened up, standing tall and still. His hair and eyes were black. The features of his face were cruel-looking, yet he was very handsome. He was dressed in good clothes, like a gentleman, but his skin was as dark as a savage's. I guessed who he was. "Are you Mr. Heathcliff?" I said. He did not speak. He only nodded his head. "My name is Lockwood. I rent the house, Thrushcross Grange, from you. I thought I should come and meet you." "Come in," he said. His voice sounded so angry that he could have been saying, "Go to hell." However, he opened the gate, and we walked along the garden path. As we entered a big yard, he called out, "Joseph, bring up some wine." Then he spoke to me in a cold voice. "I shall be with you in a moment. If you need anything, ask the servant." He walked off around a corner of the house. I waited for his servant. While I waited, I looked at the strange writing on the door of the house. Among them, I saw the date, 1500, and the name, Catherine Earnshaw, carved on the door. I heard someone coming. A man appeared through a side door. He was an old man with a thin, tight mouth in a sour and angry face. I thought that this was Joseph. He looked at me meanly. "Well," he said, "you should come inside out of the cold. The mistress of the house is inside." He led me along a passage made of stones and told me to go through a door on my right. I did, and found myself in a big room where a fire was burning in a very large fireplace, like a small cave. Some frightening-looking guns were on the wall above the fireplace. Sitting close to the fire were 2 large dogs which growled at me. Beside the dogs there was a table with much food on it. And then I saw the girl who was sitting at the table. She was a beautiful girl of some 20 years, with an exquisite face framed by soft golden hair. I bowed and waited for her to speak. She only stared at me in a cool and scornful manner. I went closer to the fire. "I think there will be a storm tonight," I said. "It's begun to snow."
"You shouldn't have come here,"
she said. Then she stood up and reached for a painted box on a high shelf. It was almost too high for her. I made a move to help her. She turned upon me suddenly.
"I can get it myself,"
she said angrily. "I beg your pardon," I quickly said.
"Do you want any tea?"
she demanded, opening the box and standing with a spoon poised over the pot. "I would be happy to have a cup," I answered.
"Did anyone ask you if you wanted any?"
she said. "No," I said, smiling. "You are the person who asked me." She threw the tea leaves and the spoon into the box. But before she could say anything, the door opened and Heathcliff came in. Behind him there was a tall young man in rough clothing, with thick brown curly hair and an angry look. Heathcliff nodded to me, but his face was angry. He began shaking white snowflakes from his clothes. Through the window, I could see that snow was falling quickly. "I'm afraid I shall have to stay here for half an hour or so because of the weather," I said. "May I shelter here?" "I don't know why you have to walk around in a snowstorm," Heathcliff growled. "Don't you know that you might get lost on the moors? People who know this area often get lost on nights like this, and the weather's not going to change for some time." "Perhaps one of your boys could guide me home," I said, "and stay at my house until morning. Could you spare me one?" "No, I could not." "Oh, then I'll have to find my own way back." Heathcliff said nothing. "Are you going to make the tea?" asked the young man. He looked from me to the young lady. She stared coldly at me for a moment.
"Is he going to have any?"
she asked. "Make the tea, will you?" said Heathcliff, speaking so savagely that I started. "Bring up your chair," he added to me, and we all drew round the table. Food was passed in silence, and the three looked very angry as they ate it. I thought it my duty to make polite talk. "Mr. Heathcliff," I began, "there must be times here when you and your wife—" "My wife?" growled Heathcliff with an ugly look on his face. "My wife is dead." I saw that I had made a mistake. Then I suddenly thought that the young man at my elbow, drinking his tea out of a bowl and eating his bread with dirty hands, might be the husband of the girl. I sighed at the thought. "Mrs. Heathcliff is my daughter-in-law," said Heathcliff, as if he guessed my thoughts. He turned as he spoke and looked at the girl. She met his gaze squarely, and in that moment I saw in both their eyes a look of devilish hatred. It was quite unmistakable. "Ah," I said uneasily to the youth at my side, "so you are the happy husband—" I stopped. The young man had turned very red. "She's not my wife," he said. He let out the words with a sudden burst of strong hatred, and followed them with a curse. "Wrong again," said Heathcliff with something like a cold laugh. "I said she was my daughter-in-law. Therefore, she must have married my son. And this young man is not my son, I tell you." He smiled as if at the strangeness of the situation. "My name is Catherine Earnshaw," growled the youth, "and you'd better respect it." "I've shown it no disrespect," I replied, amused at his tone of voice. He stared at me for a moment and then went on putting food into his mouth. I said no more, but sat wondering at this house of strange hatreds. As soon as the meal was finished, I stood up and went to a window. There I saw a sad sight. The dark night was coming early. The sky and hills could not be seen in the great storm of snow. "I shall need someone to take me home," I said. "The road will be buried in the snow." "Hareton, go and take the sheep into the barn," said Heathcliff. "What shall I do?" I asked, feeling annoyed. There was no reply. I looked round. Heathcliff and the young man had gone out. Mrs. Heathcliff had picked up a book. "Will you point out some landmarks by which I can find my way home?" I said.
"Take the road that you came here on,"
she answered carelessly. "If you hear of me being found dead in a swamp or a hole full of snow, I suppose it won't worry you," I said angrily.
"Why should it? I can't show you the way. They wouldn't let me, and there's no one else to take you."
"Then I'll have to stay here," I said hopelessly. She shrugged.
"I have nothing to do with that either,"
she said. "I hope this will be a lesson to you, not to go walking around on these hills," said Heathcliff's stern voice from the kitchen door. "As to staying here, you will have to share a bed with Hareton or Joseph if you do." "I can sleep on a chair in this room," I replied. "Oh, no, I'm not going to have you roaming about the place while I'm asleep," said the unkind man. That was the last straw. I uttered an expression of disgust and went past Heathcliff into the yard. I saw Joseph in the barn milking cows by the light of a lantern. In my anger I moved towards him, snatched up the light, called out that I would send it back on the morrow, and rushed toward the gate. "Master, he's stealing a lantern!" shouted Joseph. "Hey, Gnasher! Hey, dog! Hey, Wolf! Hold him! Hold him! Hold him!" The next second 2 hairy dogs came flying at my throat, bearing me down. I heard a deep yell from Heathcliff, who was behind me. I was burning with anger, but the dogs stood over me and growled so fiercely that I dared not rise till their master walked up and dragged them off. I got to my feet then, trembling with rage, and ordered them to let me out. My words were cut short by a gush of blood from my nose. Hareton had appeared from somewhere, and he and Heathcliff stood and roared with laughter until an old woman, whose name I found was Zillah, came out to see what all the uproar was about.
"Look at the poor lad,"
she cried.
"He's almost choking. I wish you all wouldn't act this way. Come in, and I'll take care of you."
With these words she splashed a pint of icy water down my neck and took me into the kitchen. Heathcliff followed, told her to give me some liquor, and said something about a room for the night. He went out again. Zillah gave me the brandy, handed me a candle, and told me to follow her upstairs.
"And don't make a noise,"
she said.
"I don't want the master to know which room I'm giving you. He never lets anybody stay there, but it's the one you'll have to stay in tonight."
She left me in a big room with simple furniture and an old-fashioned bed made of oak wood beneath a window. I undressed and got into bed, leaving my candle burning. There was a shelf on the wall above the bed with a few books piled up in one corner. There was writing scratched on the wall, someone's name. It was repeated again and again in all kinds of writing, large and small. Catherine Earnshaw, here and there, Catherine Heathcliff, and then again, Catherine Linton. I lay back and continued spelling over the names, Catherine Earnshaw, Heathcliff, Linton, till my eyes closed and the white letters shone from the dark as vivid as ghosts, and the air seemed full with the name of Catherine. Even now, I cannot tell if what happened later on that terrible night was a dream, or whether, in fact, I had a ghostly visitor. I was lying in bed, listening to the howling wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the noises of a tree branch that touched my window as the wind came by. The branch tapped against the window. It annoyed me so much that I decided to silence it. I sat up and tried to open the window. It was stuck. I must stop it, I kept saying. The sound, indeed, was making me insane. Somehow it must and should be stopped. I raised my fist and smashed it through the glass. I put an arm through the hole to grab the branch. And then it happened. My fingers closed on the fingers of a small, ice-cold hand. Chapter 2. The Housekeeper. Is this a horrible dream? I thought. I tried to pull my arm away, but the cold hand held onto it tightly. I heard a girl's voice crying,
"Let me in! Oh, let me in!"
"Who are you?" I cried.
"Catherine Linton,"
said the voice.
"I've come home. I lost my way outside. I've come home."
I saw a beautiful young girl's pale white face looking at me through the window. "I can't let you in," I cried. "Let me go." The ghost let go of my hand. I ran away from the window and put my hands over my ears. I could not stand the sad, painful crying of the ghost. I closed my eyes, but I knew it was staring at me through the window. Finally, I felt that I had to do something or I would go crazy. "Go away, ghost!" I shouted. "I'll never let you in here." There were noises outside the window. The ghost looked as if it were going to float into the room that second. I was so afraid I could not move at all. I screamed aloud, terribly afraid. Then I heard someone running to my room. The door opened suddenly, and I saw the light of a candle. "Is anyone there?" a voice whispered. It was Heathcliff, but his voice was so different. It was soft, not loud and angry. He sounded like a different person. I tried to answer him, but I was too afraid to speak. He walked across the room, and I saw that his face was as white as the ghost's had been. Finally, I was able to say, "It's only Mr. Lockwood. I've had a bad dream, and I shouted in my sleep. I'm terribly sorry to wake you." Heathcliff turned around and saw me. "Damn you, Lockwood, it's you. Who put you in this room? No one is allowed in here." "Your old servant Zillah did it," I said. He stared at me, a strange light in his eyes. "You've broken the window," he said softly. Then he was silent. For the first time, I saw that the broken window really was real. "I don't know what you're doing here, but you might as well lie down and sleep for the rest of the night. But be quiet, for God's sake. I thought someone was being killed." "That's what would have happened if that girl had come through the window," I cried. "This Catherine Linton, she's walking the earth now, as punishment for her sins, isn't she?" I saw immediately that I had made a mistake in saying these things. Heathcliff turned white, then red. He looked at me as if I had cut him with a knife. "How dare you say these things to me? Are you mad? You don't know what you're talking about." He was so angry that he picked up a glass vase on a table and threw it against a wall. It broke into many pieces. Then he sat down on the bed, breathing very quickly. I did not understand him, but I felt sorry that I had upset him so much. I put on my clothes quickly and looked at my watch. "It isn't even 3 o'clock in the morning," I said. "I thought it would be later than that." "Mr. Lockwood," said Heathcliff quietly, "go into my room and sleep. I will not sleep again tonight." "Neither shall I, sir," I said. "I'll wait in the kitchen until morning, then I will leave." "Go wherever you want, I don't care," he said. "Don't go into the yard, though. The dogs are there. Leave me now." He gave me the candle and I left the room. Just as I was about to walk down the stairs, I heard another strange cry. I turned around and saw Heathcliff opening the window. "Come in," he cried. His voice sounded like a small child's. "Oh, Cathy, hear me this time." Through the window there was only the darkness, the wind and the snow, but nothing else. The ghost of the young girl was gone. I heard Heathcliff cry out in pain and fall down on the bed, shaking. I walked quickly and quietly down the stairs, angry with myself for listening. When I entered the little servant's kitchen, which was next to the larger family kitchen, I saw that there was a small warm fire in the fireplace. I sat down on a chair and tried to sleep. However, soon I heard someone coming. It was Catherine Earnshaw, who looked at me angrily when he saw me and told me to go into the family kitchen. When I arrived there, I saw that pretty young Mrs. Heathcliff and Zillah were already awake. Zillah was watching the fire, and Mrs. Heathcliff was kneeling on the hearth, reading a book by the light of the fire. I saw that Heathcliff was there also. He was talking to Zillah, and I knew the reason why. He was telling her never to let anyone into Catherine Linton's room again. When it began to get light outside, I left the house. The sky was clear, and it was as cold as ice. Heathcliff saw me leaving and asked me to stop. He offered to help me find my way back to my house. This was a good thing, because everything was covered in snow, and the land was so changed that I did not know it. Heathcliff did not speak to me while we walked. When we reached Thrushcross Grange, he bowed to me once and then walked away, saying nothing. I entered the house, frozen with cold, and glad to be back at home. Mrs. Dean, a kind Yorkshire woman who cared for my house, ran and met me at the door. Mrs. Dean had been sure I was dead, and she had wondered how she was ever going to find my body in the snows. After I had a large, hot meal, I asked Mrs. Dean to come and talk to me. I could not stop thinking about Heathcliff and his strange family. I hoped that Mrs. Dean might know something about Wuthering Heights. Soon I saw that I had chosen the right person to talk to. Mrs. Dean had once lived at Wuthering Heights and had cared for Heathcliff when he was a young boy. She knew many things about the family and had a long, sad story to tell. I have written it down in the coming pages. Book 2. The First Catherine, Chapter 1. The Gypsy Boy. The story of Wuthering Heights really began 25 years ago, in the summer of 1777. A family named Earnshaw lived at the house then, and that family had owned it for over 200 years. At that time, Ellen Dean was a young girl of 18. She had come to the house to take care of the Earnshaw family's 2 children, Hindley, who was 14, and little Catherine, who was 6. In those days, Wuthering Heights was a happy house. So, on the night that the strange young boy came to live with them, no one in the house felt afraid or angry. It was an extremely strange thing, though. This is how it happened. One morning, Mr. Earnshaw, the children's father, told the family that he had to go to the city of Liverpool for some business. He promised the children that he would bring them a special surprise when he returned. He was gone 3 days, and on the evening of the 3rd day the children were very excited. Mrs. Earnshaw let Cathy and Hindley stay up late to wait for their father. Just after 11 o'clock, the door opened, and Mr. Earnshaw came into the house. The children jumped for joy and ran over to him. They saw that their father's coat was in his arms, and the coat seemed to be hiding something inside it. This was the surprise. As the children watched, a surprising thing happened. The coat moved. Mr. Earnshaw held out the object to his wife and said, "Listen, wife, here is a gift from God, although he's dark enough to have come from the devil." The family and Ellen ran over to look. They saw a dirty, black-haired little boy with dark skin and large, frightened eyes. He stared at the strange people quietly and did not say anything. Mrs. Earnshaw stared at her husband. Mrs. Earnshaw seemed very upset.
"Why have you brought this child into my house? He looks like a gypsy. What are we going to do with him?"
Mr. Earnshaw told his family how he had found the little boy, cold and alone, in the streets of Liverpool. The child did not have a home and had no parents. No one would give the child a home, so Mr. Earnshaw had decided to bring the little boy home with him. "I couldn't leave him there to die in the streets," he said. Mrs. Earnshaw asked her husband many angry questions, but he did not pay attention to her. Instead, he turned to Ellen Dean and said, "Take the boy away and wash him, Ellen. You can find him some clean clothes, and then he can sleep with Cathy and Hindley." Ellen did what Mr. Earnshaw wanted, but when she took the boy into the children's room, the children would not sleep with him. They would not even let him into their room. At last, Ellen put the child in many blankets and let him sleep on the stairs. She almost hoped he would be gone in the morning. When Mr. Earnshaw saw the boy sleeping on the stairs the next morning, he was angry. Ellen was sent away from the house for a few days as a punishment. But when she came back, she saw that some things had changed. The boy was still there, and he had a name, Heathcliff. This was the name of one of Mr. Earnshaw's sons, who had died when he was a baby. And Heathcliff and Cathy were now best friends. But Ellen saw that Hindley hated Heathcliff and was cruel to him whenever Mr. Earnshaw was not looking. Heathcliff did not say anything about the way Hindley treated him. He was a quiet, patient child. Strangely, Mr. Earnshaw seemed to love this boy the best of all his children. Ellen thought that this was why Hindley did not like Heathcliff. Mr. Earnshaw loved the strange, dark boy more than little Cathy, who was as pretty as a flower, but much too naughty and bad. Sadly, Mrs. Earnshaw died 2 years later. She had been quiet and unhappy ever since Heathcliff had come, and no one understood why. Mr. Earnshaw was getting older, and the 3 children were cared for by Ellen. It seemed that Mr. Earnshaw did not have long to live. Almost overnight, he had become tired and sick. He did not leave the warm fireplace, and always seemed angry with everyone, except Heathcliff. Whenever he saw Hindley and Heathcliff fighting, he grew angry at Hindley, and would have hit his son if he had not been so sick and weak. Finally, Hindley went away to college, and Ellen hoped that the house would be quiet again. However, this did not happen because of Joseph, the head servant. Joseph was a very cold and religious man. He told Mr. Earnshaw and everyone in the house terrible stories about Heathcliff and Cathy. He did not like young people, and he always made Cathy seem like a terrible girl. It was true that Cathy was wild. She was always laughing and talking and playing tricks on people. but she was quickly becoming the most beautiful young lady in the area. The strangest thing about Cathy was her feelings for Heathcliff. The worst thing you could do to Cathy was keeping her away from Heathcliff. And Heathcliff would do anything for her. He looked at her as if she were a princess. Ellen knew there was a deep connection between them. She wondered what might happen. One night in October, a strong wind was blowing outside. The family was together, sitting by the fire. Joseph was reading his Bible as usual. Ellen was sewing, and Cathy was leaning against her father's knee. He was stroking her hair. Mr. Earnshaw seemed very tired and old that night. He sighed and said to Cathy, "Why can't you always be a good girl, Cathy?" Cathy only laughed and said,
"Being good all the time is boring."
But then she kissed her father and said she would sing him to sleep. She began to sing in a soft, pretty voice, and soon her father was asleep. Ellen told Cathy not to move so that she would not wake her father up. Everyone was still and quiet for half an hour. Then Joseph said he had to wake Mr. Earnshaw up because it was time for bed. He called Mr. Earnshaw's name and touched his arm, but he did not move. He looked carefully at Mr. Earnshaw, and the look on his face changed. Quickly, Joseph whispered to the children to go to bed immediately.
"I'll say good night to Father first,"
said Cathy, and before Joseph could stop her, she put her arms around her father. Cathy knew the truth immediately. She screamed,
"Oh, Heathcliff! He's dead!"
And the two began to cry. So Mr. Earnshaw died, and after his death, things were very different at Wuthering Heights. Chapter 2. Trouble in the House. Hindley came home for his father's funeral. He was married now, and his wife was young. No one knew anything about her because Hindley had not told his family about his marriage. Hindley had been away for 3 years, and he had changed. He spoke differently, and he wore better clothes. He told Ellen that she and Joseph had to stay in the little servant's kitchen because he was going to control the house now. However, one thing had not changed. Hindley still hated Heathcliff. Now that his father was dead, Hindley knew he could treat Heathcliff as badly as he wanted. He promised that Heathcliff would work in the fields and live with the servants. At first, Heathcliff did not care about these changes. As long as Cathy was near him, he was happy. Cathy played with Heathcliff while he worked in the fields, and the two of them were always running around outside. They were just like two wild Indians. One Sunday evening, Cathy and Heathcliff were sent out of the house for being bad. Ellen could not find them anywhere. She said nothing to Hindley, but she was very worried. After everyone else was sleeping, Ellen waited at the window. She could not sleep until the children had returned. She heard steps coming up the road and ran down to the front door. Soon she saw Heathcliff, who was walking towards the house alone.
"Heathcliff, where's Miss Cathy?"
Ellen said. Heathcliff frowned at her. "At Thrushcross Grange," he answered. "We were near that place, and we wanted to look inside their house. We wanted to see how the rich Linton family spends their time. We found a hole in the fence and went up to the house. We looked into a window and saw the 2 Linton children. Their parents were not in the room, but their son Edgar and his sister Isabella were playing. We stared at them for a little while, and then made noises to frighten them, like ghosts. They heard these noises and yelled for their parents. Then we ran away, laughing. I was holding Cathy's hand, but then she fell down."
"What about Cathy?"
asked Ellen impatiently. "The Lintons let their dog outside," said Heathcliff quietly. and it bit Cathy on the leg. She didn't cry out, but I did. I was throwing stones at the dog when a servant came and picked Cathy up. He carried her into the house, and I followed them. The Lintons were very excited when they saw that it was Cathy Earnshaw. They worried about her and said she could stay there until her leg was better. But they would not let me stay, so here I am. Ellen shook her head.
There will be trouble in the morning.
Ellen was right. Heathcliff and Cathy's adventure made Hindley very angry. He did not like it when Mr. Linton told him that he had to look after his young sister. Hindley told Heathcliff that if he spoke one more word to Cathy, he would be sent away. Hindley's wife, Mrs. Earnshaw, was told to watch Cathy when she returned to Wuthering Heights. Cathy was gone a long time. She stayed at the Lintons' home for 5 weeks, and it was Christmas when she came home. She looked so different. The Lintons had given Cathy fine clothes to wear, and she looked like a beautiful young lady. Everyone was very happy with Cathy, except Heathcliff. Cathy's new look seemed to upset him. "Boy, you'd better come and tell Miss Catherine welcome home, like the other servants," yelled Hindley, pushing the boy forward. Heathcliff looked the same as ever, but as soon as Cathy saw him, she threw her arms around him. Then she stared at him and began to laugh.
"Oh, Heathcliff, you do look cross,"
she said.
"And so dirty."
Heathcliff looked at her and said, "I'm not going to stay here and be laughed at. I like to be dirty, and I will be dirty." With that he ran out of the room. In the morning Heathcliff got up early and left for the moors. He did not return until after the family had gone to church. When he came back, he did not seem so angry. He walked around the kitchen for a while and said, "Help me to get cleaned up, Ellen. I'm going to be good now." Ellen smiled.
"All right,"
she said gently.
"Now, Edgar and Isabella Linton are coming here to dinner after church, so you must act nicely."
Heathcliff said, "Edgar Linton is nothing but a crybaby, but I wish that I was rich like him." Ellen laughed.
"You're right. He does cry a lot,"
she said.
"But when you're all clean, and you take that angry look off your face, you'll be very handsome."
She talked to him while she cleaned him up, and Heathcliff lost his frown and began to look very nice. Soon they heard Catherine bringing the Linton children into the house. Ellen brought Heathcliff gently toward the door.
"Now, go into them, dear, and show them what a fine boy you are."
Unfortunately, the first person Heathcliff saw was Hindley. "You stay out of this room," he said loudly. "You're a servant, and we don't want you stealing the food."
"Oh, no, sir. He'll be very good. He must have his share of everything,"
Ellen cried. "Well, he's not allowed to be downstairs before dark," shouted Hindley. "Just look at this hair. Trying to impress the young ladies, aren't you, boy? Well, wait until I get my hands on that hair. I'll pull it a little longer. It's like a horse's mane over his eyes," said Edgar Linton, who was standing at the door. He was a pale and thin boy of 16. That was it. Heathcliff could not have Edgar Linton speak to him in this way. He grabbed a dish of hot applesauce, the first thing he saw, and threw it into Edgar's face. Edgar screamed loudly, and Hindley grabbed Heathcliff and carried him upstairs and whipped him. Ellen got a cloth and wiped Edgar's nose and neck. Cathy just stood there, her eyes burning with anger.
"You shouldn't have spoken to him,"
she told Edgar.
"Oh, how I hate him to be punished. I won't eat now. Oh, stop crying, Edgar, and be quiet, Isabella. No one's hurt you."
"All right, children, sit down. Everything's all right," cried Hindley, coming into the room. "That terrible boy has been punished now. He won't bother you again. Next time, Master Edgar, you should hit him back. It will make you hungry for your dinner." Ellen served the people their dinner. It was painful to watch Cathy sitting still and not eating anything. Her eyes were shining with tears. After dinner they had a dance. Cathy wanted Heathcliff to dance with her, but Hindley would not allow him. While they were all singing after the dance, Cathy was able to leave the room. She went up the stairs in the dark. She was gone a long time. Ellen tried to find her, but Cathy had hidden. She had climbed out of one window, walked on the roof, and climbed into the window of Heathcliff's room. Ellen had a hard time trying to make Cathy come down again. Finally, Heathcliff and Cathy came downstairs together. Cathy made Ellen take Heathcliff into the kitchen and give him something to eat. However, Heathcliff was in pain and could not eat very much. He sat next to the fire and stared at it in silence.
"What are you thinking about?"
Ellen asked him. Heathcliff said quietly, "I am thinking about how I get my revenge on Hindley," he said coldly. "I don't care how long I have to wait, if I can do it at last. Give me time to think, and I'll make my plan." Chapter 3. Cathy's Anger. The next June, Hindley's son was born, but his mother, Hindley's wife, was dead within the month. The boy was named Hareton, and he was given to Ellen to take care of. Hindley did not seem to care about the baby, as long as he was healthy and did not cry. He was upset that his wife had died, and began to drink every day. Hindley continued to treat Heathcliff terribly, and the boy grew more angry and proud as the years passed. Edgar Linton was very interested in Cathy, even though not many good people wanted to go near Wuthering Heights. They did not like Hindley and his drinking. But Edgar liked Cathy, and he would have visited her, but he was afraid of Hindley. One afternoon, Hindley was away from the house. Heathcliff was about 16 years old then. He was a handsome boy, with black hair and eyes. Cathy and Heathcliff were still friends, but Heathcliff did not like to show his feelings for her. On this day, Heathcliff came into the house, while Ellen was helping Cathy put on a pretty dress. Cathy did not know that Heathcliff was there, and she had asked Edgar Linton to come over. "Cathy, why are you wearing that silk dress?" Heathcliff asked. "Is someone coming here?" Cathy looked worried.
"Edgar and Isabella are coming to visit,"
she said. She did not look at Heathcliff. Heathcliff looked angry. "Tell Ellen to say that you can't see them," he said. "Don't leave me for those silly friends of yours." But they heard a horse in the yard, so it was too late. Heathcliff went into the kitchen. Then Edgar Linton entered. His face was happy at the thought of seeing Cathy again. "I hope I haven't come too soon," he said, looking at Ellen. Ellen turned away and began to clean up a corner of the room.
"No, Edgar,"
answered Cathy sweetly.
"What are you doing, Ellen?" "Only my work, Miss Cathy,"
Ellen said. The truth was that Hindley had told Ellen to watch Cathy and Edgar when they were together. Cathy stepped up behind Ellen and whispered angrily,
"Ellen, go away! I want to be alone with him."
Ellen said.
"I'm sure Mr. Edgar won't mind if I finish my work."
Cathy looked at Ellen.
"I order you to go,"
she said.
"I'm sorry, Miss Cathy, but Master Hindley asked me to do it,"
said Ellen. Immediately, Cathy grabbed the cloth from Ellen's hand and pinched her on the arm. It hurt, and Ellen shouted angrily,
"Miss Cathy, that's a nasty trick. You have no right to pinch me." "I didn't touch you, you lying woman!"
cried Cathy, her ears all red with rage. Ellen held out her arm and showed a purple mark.
"What's this, then?"
she said loudly. Cathy stamped her foot in a fury and then slapped Ellen hard across the face. The slap made Ellen's eyes filled with tears from the pain. "Catherine!" cried Edgar, very surprised. Cathy did not answer him.
"Leave the room, Ellen,"
she said, shaking all over. Little Hareton was sitting on the floor. He loved Ellen and went everywhere with her. He started to cry, and Cathy seemed to become even angrier. She picked up the child and shook him. Edgar grabbed the baby and took hold of her hands to stop her. Immediately she slapped Edgar across the ear. He drew back. Without a word to Cathy, Ellen took Hareton and walked off into the kitchen. She left the door open because she wanted to hear what would happen. Edgar got his coat and hat and walked toward the door.
"Where are you going, Edgar?"
cried Cathy, running to the door. He tried to move past Cathy, but she would not let him move.
"You must not go,"
she cried. "Well, I'm not staying here after that," he said. "I won't come here again either. What is wrong with you, Cathy? Why did you treat Ellen so terribly? And then you lied about it. I saw you pinch Ellen."
I didn't,
she cried.
"I didn't do anything. All right, go if you want to. Go away. And now I'll cry until I'm sick."
She dropped on her knees and began to cry. Edgar walked out of the door, but then he stopped. There he stopped. Ellen saw him look back. Suddenly he turned and went into the house again. He put his arms around Cathy and began to comfort her. Ellen came in after an hour to tell them that Hindley had come home and was drunk. Cathy and Edgar were sitting quietly together, and Edgar was staring at Cathy lovingly. Ellen wondered how Cathy felt. When Edgar found out that Hindley was back, he left quickly. Cathy went to her room. Ellen went to hide Hareton because she did not want his father to see him when he was drunk. However, Hindley ran into the kitchen before she could hide the boy. He grabbed Hareton and cried, "Ellen, the boy needs a haircut. Give me the scissors, and I'll cut it all off. Kiss me, my darling boy." "What? You won't? To think that I could have such a terrible child. I'll break your neck, you little monster." The child was kicking and screaming in his father's arms, and when Hindley carried him upstairs and held him over the staircase, he screamed even louder. Ellen ran after them, crying out that he would frighten the child. Suddenly, when his father was at the top of the stairs, Hareton gave a sudden kick. His father dropped him, and he fell. Ellen screamed, but then she saw that he was safe. Heathcliff, who had come into the room suddenly, had held out his arms, caught the child, and set him down on his feet. Hindley came down the stairs, pale and sober. "Is he hurt?" he cried.
"Hurt? No,"
cried Ellen angrily.
"But you're worse than a savage, treating your son in that way. The boy hates you, and that's the truth. Look at what's happened to you."
Hindley laughed. "I don't care. Take the boy away. And Heathcliff, stay out of my way. You've done something good for once in your life, so I wouldn't want to kill you tonight." Ellen and Heathcliff watched him walk into the sitting room. He took a bottle of liquor from the dresser and then kicked the door shut. "It's a pity he doesn't fall down and kill himself with drinking," said Heathcliff. Ellen went into the kitchen and sat down with Hareton on her lap. At the time, she thought Heathcliff had left the house and went to the barn. But he was only outside the kitchen. He sat down on a bench outside the kitchen and remained quiet. Ellen was singing to the child when Cathy entered the room and said,
"Ellen, are you alone?" "Yes, Miss Cathy."
Cathy came in and sat down by the fire. Ellen thought that she looked worried.
"Where's Heathcliff?"
she asked.
"In the barn, I think."
Cathy didn't say anything. After a while, Ellen looked up and saw a tear fall down Cathy's cheek. She pretended not to notice, however.
"Oh, dear, Ellen,"
cried Cathy.
"I'm so unhappy." "Then you're very hard to please,"
Ellen answered.
"when you have so many friends and so few problems." "Ellen, will you keep a secret for me?"
Cathy asked.
"I don't know. Is it important?"
asked Ellen.
"Yes, it is. I must tell someone. Edgar Linton asked me to marry him today. Should I have said yes or no?" "Well, after the terrible way you acted today, I would say no to him, Miss Cathy,"
said Ellen firmly.
"If he asked you to marry him after all that, he must be very stupid."
Cathy stood up, her face red.
"Well, I said yes,"
she went on.
"Was I wrong?" "Do you love him?"
Ellen asked.
"Oh, yes. He's handsome and rich, and I'll just love being the greatest lady in the area." "Well, then what are you unhappy about, girl?"
asked Ellen. She did not understand Cathy.
"I feel unhappy here and here,"
said Cathy, putting one hand on her forehead and the other on her heart. She sat in a chair, and her face was frightened and sad.
"I have no reason to marry Edgar Linton,"
she said.
"If Hindley had not made Heathcliff into a servant, with no education or money, I would never marry Edgar. But I can't marry Heathcliff now, when he's nothing but a farm boy. Oh, Ellen, I would be so ashamed,"
she cried. There was a long silence.
"Heathcliff can never know how much I love him,"
she said finally.
"Ellen, Heathcliff is more myself than I am. I don't love him because he's handsome or intelligent or hates Hindley as much as I do. I am Heathcliff, and he is me. We love the same things and feel about things the same way. He's always, always, always in my mind, Ellen, but it would shame me to marry him."
As soon as Cathy had mentioned Heathcliff's name, Ellen had heard a slight sound. When she turned her head, she saw Heathcliff stand up from the bench by the wall. He had listened to Cathy's words, until he heard Cathy say that it would lower her to marry him. Then he had left without a sound. Ellen knew what he was feeling. Chapter 4. Heathcliff is missing. However, Cathy had not heard anything.
"But, Miss Cathy, do you know what this will mean to Heathcliff?"
said Ellen.
"After you marry Edgar Linton, Heathcliff will be alone in the world."
Cathy looked surprised.
"Alone?"
she said.
"Oh, no. I wouldn't marry Edgar if it meant that Heathcliff would be alone. Edgar must learn to like Heathcliff, that's all. Don't you see, Ellen, that if Heathcliff and I were married, we would be terribly poor. We would be so unhappy. But if I marry Linton, I can help Heathcliff and take him away from here. Hindley won't be able to hurt him any more." "Miss Cathy, you would use your husband's money to help another man,"
cried Ellen.
"That's the worst reason you've given for marrying Edgar." "It isn't,"
cried Cathy.
"It's the best."
She sighed and said,
"I think so much of Heathcliff. He is the best part of me." "Well,"
Ellen said,
"I don't really understand any of this. Still, I will keep your secret."
They stopped talking when Joseph entered the room. Cathy watched Hareton while Ellen cooked dinner. Soon Joseph said, "Where's Heathcliff?"
"In the barn, I think,"
said Ellen.
"I'll call him."
Ellen went and called for Heathcliff, but he did not answer. When she came back, she whispered to Cathy that she thought that Heathcliff had heard much of what Cathy had said. She thought Heathcliff may have become upset and left the house. Cathy jumped up, frightened, and ran to look for him. Cathy was gone for so long that Joseph and Ellen decided to eat their supper. They were just beginning to eat when Cathy ran into the room and told Joseph to find Heathcliff and bring him back. She had not seen him. Joseph did not want to do this, but he left. Cathy walked up and down the room.
"Where, oh, where is he?"
she kept saying. Joseph could not find Heathcliff. He told Cathy and Ellen that the night was too dark, and there was a storm coming. "He will come home when it rains," Joseph said. They waited. Cathy could not keep still. She kept walking from the gate to the door. Finally, she went out into the road. She did not seem to care about the thunder and the heavy rain that was falling. She stayed outside, calling Heathcliff's name over and over. About 20 minutes later, Cathy returned through the storm. Wet and shaking, she went to bed. The next morning, Cathy had a fever and was terribly sick. The doctor told Ellen that Cathy should not be upset in any way, or she would become sicker. Mrs. Linton came to see Cathy many times a week. When Cathy was feeling a little better, Mrs. Linton took Cathy to Thrushcross Grange to care for her. However, this poor woman and her husband both got the fever and died. Cathy came back to Wuthering Heights, and she was harder to control than ever. Hindley let her do anything she wanted, as long as she did not try to stop him from drinking. Hindley wanted Cathy to bring honor to the Earnshaw family by marrying Edgar Linton. Ellen thought that it was strange that Cathy never talked about Heathcliff, and Heathcliff did not return. Edgar Linton, of course, was still in love with Cathy. He was extremely happy on the day they married, 3 years after his parents died. Ellen Dean was asked to leave Wuthering Heights and go to Thrushcross Grange, the Lintons' house, with Cathy. Ellen did not want to, but when Cathy told Hindley, he ordered Ellen to go. Hindley did not want any more women in his house, he said. So Ellen took Cathy and herself to Thrushcross Grange. There, everyone lived happily for some time. There were times when Cathy was gloomy and silent, but Ellen felt that the Lintons were happy with each other. Until, one day, Ellen met a man in the garden. Chapter 5. Heathcliff Returns. It was a beautiful September evening. Ellen was coming back from the garden with some apples. The moon was just beginning to rise, and there were shadows in the corners of the house. Ellen stood still for a moment, watching the beautiful moon. Suddenly, she heard someone behind her say, "Good evening, Ellen." It was the deep voice of a man. She turned around, a little afraid. She saw a man with fine clothes and a dark face and hair. She stared at him in surprise. "I've been waiting in the garden for an hour," he said. "I knew I couldn't go into the house. Don't you know me, Ellen?" She caught her breath and stared at the man. His face was dark and handsome, and his eyes were full of black fire. She remembered those eyes.
"Heathcliff, is it really you?"
she whispered. "Yes, it's I," he said. He stared at the windows of the house. They were all dark. "Is she at home?" he asked quickly. He stared at her with his dark eyes. "Where is she, Ellen? Go to her and say that a man from Gimmerton wishes to speak to her."
"Heathcliff, no,"
said Ellen.
"I don't know what it would do to her. How will she respond?"
"Don't worry about that," Heathcliff said quickly. "Go and tell her. I'm in hell until you do." Ellen did not think she had any choice, so she went into the house. When she got to the sitting room, she saw Edgar and Cathy sitting by the window. They were looking out at the beautiful park in the moonlight. The room seemed peaceful. Ellen did not want to speak to them, but she knew she had to.
Mrs. Linton, a man from Gimmerton wishes to speak to you,
Ellen said nervously.
What does he want?
Asked Cathy.
I don't know, madam. Well, close the curtains, Ellen,
said Cathy.
And please bring in the tea. I'll be back again in a moment.
She went out. Who is it, Ellen? Asked Edgar. Ellen did not want to hide the truth from him.
It is Heathcliff, sir,
she said.
You remember him. He's come back.
Young Mr. Linton looked shocked. What? That boy is here? He jumped up and walked across the room to the window. He opened it and leaned out. Cathy and Heathcliff must have been below, for he called out quickly, Don't stand there, love. Bring the man inside. In a few moments Cathy flew upstairs, wild-eyed, and threw her arms around her husband's neck.
Edgar, darling,
she cried.
Heathcliff's come back.
I know, he cried. I didn't think he was such a wonderful person.
Oh, Edgar, I know you didn't like him,
she said.
But please be friends now. For me. Should I tell him to come upstairs?
He stared at her. Here? He said.
Well, of course,
cried Cathy.
Where else?
She was about to run downstairs again, but Edgar stopped her. He turned to Ellen and said, Ellen, tell Heathcliff to come up. And Catherine, dear, try not to be silly. The man is only a poor servant after all. When Ellen returned with Heathcliff, Cathy ran forward, took both his hands and led him to Edgar. Then she grabbed her husband's fingers and put them into Heathcliff's. Now that Ellen could really see Heathcliff, she could not believe how he had changed. Heathcliff looked like a tall, handsome man, while Edgar still looked like a boy. Heathcliff's actions were like a gentleman's, but Ellen saw that his dark eyes were still wild. Edgar did not know what to say to the man who his wife seemed to love so much. Sit down, sir, he said at last. I am glad that your return makes my wife so happy. And I am glad also, answered Heathcliff calmly. Heathcliff sat down opposite Cathy. Cathy could not stop looking at him. Ellen saw the look on Edgar's face when Cathy suddenly stood up and took Heathcliff's hands again.
Heathcliff, it's like a dream,
Cathy cried.
A wonderful dream. Oh, how could you stay away from me for so many years? Did you ever think of me?
I've thought of you all the time, he said. I learned you were married only a little while ago. I have had many hard adventures since I saw you last, but all my struggles have been only for you, Cathy. Catherine, said Edgar harshly, come to the table. Our tea is getting cold. Heathcliff did not stay more than an hour. When he left, Ellen asked him if he was going to Gimmerton. No, I am going to Wuthering Heights, he answered. Hindley asked me to come there when I visited this morning. Ellen did not know what to think. Why would Hindley ask Heathcliff to stay with him? The two men hated each other. Ellen remembered that Heathcliff had promised her he would have his revenge on Hindley. Ellen had a feeling that it would have been better for everyone if Heathcliff had stayed away from Wuthering Heights. Chapter 6. The Fight. Heathcliff did not go to Thrushcross Grange very often. He seemed to know that Edgar did not like him to come. But Edgar soon found out that there was another person who wanted Heathcliff to visit. Edgar's younger sister, Isabella, was a pretty young girl of 18. She was always happy and healthy, but Edgar saw that as soon as Heathcliff returned, Isabella became upset about something. One day, Isabella suddenly began to cry. When Cathy asked her what was wrong, Isabella said that she had fallen in love with Heathcliff. Cathy was surprised.
"Oh, Isabella, you know nothing about him. I do, and so does Ellen here. He's a strange man. I know he couldn't love a Linton, but he would marry you for your money in a second. I am his friend, and I have known him for years. Stay away from him."
Isabella looked at Cathy angrily.
"His friend?"
she cried.
"Oh, I like that. You're worse than 20 enemies. Heathcliff is a fine, wonderful man, and I know you, Catherine Linton. You're not telling the truth about this."
Cathy looked as if she was going to slap Isabella, but she only shook her head.
"I've warned you, Isabella,"
she said.
"You think you know best, but you'll see. I can't do anything more for you."
She left the room, and Isabella turned to Ellen.
"It isn't true, Ellen, is it?"
she sobbed.
"I love him so." "Miss Isabella, Mrs. Linton is right about this,"
said Ellen seriously.
"She knows him, and he's not the right man for you. We don't know anything about him. How did he get rich? Why is he staying at Wuthering Heights, in the house of a man he hates? Hindley and Heathcliff are together every night, drinking and playing cards. Hindley borrows money from Heathcliff all the time. You don't want this kind of a husband, don't you see, dear?" "Oh, Ellen, you're as bad as Cathy,"
cried Isabella.
"I won't listen to either of you."
Then she ran out of the room. Many things happened the next day. Edgar had to go off to town on business. Heathcliff knew this, and so he visited Thrushcross Grange as soon as Edgar had left. Cathy and Isabella were sitting in the library, not speaking to each other. Suddenly the door opened, and Heathcliff came in. When she saw him, Cathy laughed and said,
"Heathcliff, come in. I want you to meet someone who loves you more than I do myself. My poor little sister-in-law is just dying for you. Her head has been turned by your handsome face."
Isabella turned pale and ran out of the room. After she had gone, Heathcliff turned to Cathy and said, "Cathy, why did you do that? Were you telling me the truth?"
"I was,"
said Cathy.
"She wants to marry you."
"Ha! Why would I want to marry a little mouse like her?" Heathcliff asked. He was looking at Cathy with deep feeling in his eyes. She stared back at him and turned red. Suddenly, the look on Heathcliff's face changed. "Won't she have a lot of money some day?" he said softly to himself. There was a strange look in his eyes. The next time Heathcliff came to Thrushcross Grange, Isabella was sitting in the garden. As soon as Heathcliff saw Isabella, he looked quickly at the house to see if anyone was watching him. Ellen was standing by the kitchen window, but she pretended not to see him. She saw Heathcliff walk over to Isabella and speak to her. Isabella turned her face away, and Heathcliff laid his hand on her arm. After looking at the house again, Heathcliff spoke to Isabella again and then took her in his arms. Ellen thought she had to do something. She went to find Edgar Linton and tell him what was happening. "I will not allow this," Edgar cried. "It's bad enough that my wife has this Heathcliff for a friend and tries to make me like him. But for him to treat Isabella this way, I won't have it. Call my men, Ellen. I'll deal with Heathcliff." Edgar went down and told his men to wait in the yard. He went into the kitchen, where he saw Heathcliff standing by the window. Cathy was speaking to him. She stopped talking when she saw her husband and then said,
"Have you been listening at the door, Edgar?"
Heathcliff laughed at this. "Sir," said Edgar quietly, "I have allowed you to visit this house because of my wife's feelings for you. You and she were once childhood friends, but from now on you cannot enter this house. I will give you 3 minutes to leave here before I order the servants to throw you out." Heathcliff only laughed and said, "It's too bad, Edgar, that you're not brave enough to fight me by yourself." Edgar went to get his men, but Cathy ran to the door and closed and locked it. Then she turned to her husband.
"If you don't have the courage to fight him,"
she said angrily,
"then apologize, or let yourself be beaten. I'll eat this key before I'll let you have it."
Edgar tried to take the key from her, but she threw it into the fire. At this he trembled and grew pale. "I wish you joy with that coward," said Heathcliff coldly. "And you wanted to marry him instead of me." Heathcliff stepped forward and pushed at the chair on which Edgar was leaning. And then, to Ellen's joy and amazement, Edgar jumped up and hit Heathcliff hard in the face. Heathcliff fell back, and while he was trying to find his breath, Edgar walked out of the other door slowly.
"Oh, no! Leave now, Heathcliff. He'll be back with other men,"
cried Cathy. Heathcliff decided he did not want to fight the servants. He broke the lock on the inside of the door and ran out. Cathy ran upstairs to the sitting-room and told Ellen to follow her. She looked terrible.
"Oh, Ellen, I don't know what to do,"
she cried.
"I've got too many feelings and thoughts running through my head. Tell my husband that I'm sick. I want to frighten him."
When she saw Edgar coming up to the sitting-room, Ellen said nothing, but she went to the room's door to listen. She wanted to hear what Edgar and Cathy had to say. Edgar was the first to speak. "Cathy," he said, "you must make up your mind whether you want Heathcliff or me. You can't be my wife and his friend at the same time."
"Leave me alone,"
said Cathy angrily.
"I'm sick. Can't you see that? Leave me. Leave me alone."
Then she ran out of the room. Ellen followed her, but Cathy's bedroom door was locked. For 2 days Cathy stayed in her room and did not eat or speak to anyone. Edgar spent time in the library and did not even ask how Cathy was. However, he did speak with Isabella for a long time about Heathcliff. After that, Isabella was very upset and cried almost all the time. But Edgar only read his books and did nothing. Ellen continued her work, feeling sure that the only normal person at Thrushcross Grange was herself. Chapter 7. The Marriage. On the 3rd day, Cathy asked to see Ellen.
"I'm going to die,"
Cathy cried,
"since no one cares about me. What is my husband doing?" "He is alone in his library,"
said Ellen.
"Poor man, he is all alone. His books!"
Cathy cried.
"Why is he reading books when I am dying? Oh, how I wish I had never married him. I wish I was a girl again and out on the moors. Open the window, Ellen, now." "No, it will make you cold, and you will become even sicker,"
Ellen said firmly.
"All right,"
said Cathy.
"I'll open it myself."
She got up from the bed before Ellen could stop her and went to the window. She opened it and leaned out. She did not seem to care about the terrible cold. Ellen begged her to get back into bed, but Cathy did not listen. She stared out of the window, her eyes shining with happiness. There was no moon, and everything outside was dark and quiet.
"Look,"
Cathy said suddenly.
"I can see the lights shining from Wuthering Heights. That's my room with the candle in it, and the other candle is in Joseph's room. He's waiting for me to come home. Well, Joseph, you must wait longer. To find Wuthering Heights, we must pass by the Gimmerton Church. Heathcliff, we've seen the ghosts in that churchyard, haven't we? We used to tell each other to stand in the churchyard when we were children and call to the ghosts, 'Heathcliff, I'm dying, and I might become a ghost in that church soon. Will you come if I ask you? If you do, I'll keep you with me forever, my love, I'll not lie under that ground by myself. The people might bury me 12 feet under the ground, but I won't rest until you are with me, Heathcliff. I never will."
Ellen almost cried when she heard these words. Suddenly the door opened and Edgar came in.
"Oh, sir, Miss Catherine is sick and will not stay in bed."
"Sick?" he said, coming forward. "Shut the window, Ellen. Cathy, what is wrong?" He stopped speaking when he saw his wife's face. He took her in his arms.
"Ah, so you have come, have you, Edgar?"
Cathy cried.
"Well, you can't keep me here. I'm going to a new home, a little home in the churchyard, under the ground. I'm dying. Edgar, I don't want you now. Go back to your books." "Sir, she does not know what she is saying,"
said Ellen quickly.
"You should find the doctor immediately."
"You're right, Ellen. She really is sick. Go and find the doctor," said Edgar. Ellen ran out of the house to find the doctor. But as she went through the garden that night, she thought she heard the sound of a horse running nearby. At that time she did not think about it, but this was a strange sound at 2 o'clock in the morning. Who was riding a horse at that hour? Ellen found the doctor and took him to Cathy. She was sleeping and her husband was sitting by her bed. The doctor told them that Cathy was extremely sick. If they wanted her to live, Cathy must be kept quiet and nothing could upset her mind and emotions. That night Edgar and Ellen did not sleep. When the other servants woke up, they walked around the house quietly, speaking in whispers. Everyone was awake but Isabella, and the servants began to talk about how deeply she was sleeping. Suddenly, one of the servants came running upstairs and ran into Cathy's bedroom.
"Oh, dear!"
she cried.
"Master Edgar, our young lady." "Be quiet, girl,"
cried Ellen angrily. "Speak lower, Mary. My wife is sick," said Mr. Linton. "What's the matter? What's wrong with Miss Isabella?"
"She's gone. I had to go into Gimmerton this morning, and I found out that Heathcliff's taken her away."
"Ellen," said Edgar quietly, "go and find Isabella." Ellen ran and looked into Isabella's room. It was empty. When she came back, Edgar looked at her face and knew what had happened.
"Should we try to find her and bring her back?"
Ellen asked him. He shook his head. "Isabella has made her own choice," he said quietly. "From this day on, she is not my sister any more. She has hurt me and the honor of our family very terribly by running away with him." Edgar did not speak about Isabella for a very long time. Chapter 8. Isabella's Letter. For 2 months no one knew anything about Heathcliff and Isabella. For most of that time Cathy was extremely sick. Cathy never asked about Heathcliff. When Isabella wrote Edgar a letter saying that she had married Heathcliff, Cathy did not say anything or act angry or sad. Edgar did not even answer the letter. But soon after this, Ellen got a letter from Isabella. She had just come back from her honeymoon with Heathcliff. The letter said,
"Dear Ellen, last night we arrived at Wuthering Heights. I heard that Catherine has been very ill. I should not write to her, and I do not want to. I know my brother is too angry to answer the letter I sent him. But I must write to someone, so I have chosen you. I want to ask you a question, Ellen. Is this Heathcliff, who is now my husband, a man? If he is a man, is he insane or sick in his head? Is he a devil? I cannot tell you why I am asking you these things. But I beg you to tell me about this man whom I have married. You must visit me at Wuthering Heights, Ellen, as soon as you can. Please bring me some letter from Edgar. Ellen, I have been a fool, and I am miserable. Heathcliff has already made me hate him. Do not tell my brother or Cathy about this letter. I will wait to see you every day. Hurry, Isabella."
When Ellen read this letter, she went to Edgar and told him that Isabella was with Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights. She also told Edgar that Isabella was truly sorry about Cathy's sickness and asked her brother to forgive her. "Ellen, there is nothing to forgive Isabella for," Edgar said. "She made her own choice. You may visit Wuthering Heights this afternoon. Tell her that I am not angry, but I am sorry to have lost her as my sister, because when she married Heathcliff, she lost me as her brother. Tell her that I do not want to see her."
"Won't you write her a little note, sir?"
Ellen asked. "No," he answered. "I will not write to anyone in Heathcliff's family." Ellen did not know how she was going to tell all these things to poor Isabella, but she walked to Wuthering Heights anyway. As she walked up the garden path to the house, she saw Isabella looking through the window. Ellen nodded and waved, but Isabella jumped back as if she was afraid to be seen. Ellen went into the house without knocking on the door. She felt that since she had lived there for many years, Wuthering Heights was almost like her own house. But Ellen saw that the house was now dark and dirty. It had been a cheerful place when old Mr. Earnshaw, Cathy's father, was alive. Hindley was not there. Heathcliff sat at a table, looking at some papers. He stood up when Ellen appeared and asked her to sit down. Ellen thought that Heathcliff had never looked better. He wore very good clothes and was healthy, handsome, and strong. If a stranger saw him, she would think he was a fine gentleman from a rich family. But Isabella, his wife, looked terrible. Isabella's pretty face was pale and sad, and her hair was dirty. Her dress was old and worn. But when she saw Ellen, she ran to say hello. She held out her hand, hoping that Ellen had a letter from Edgar to give her. Ellen shook her head sadly. "If you have anything from my wife, Ellen, then give it to her now," said Heathcliff.
"I have nothing for her,"
Ellen said.
"My master sends his love, Miss Isabella, but he thinks it is better if you do not meet."
Isabella looked as though her heart would break, but she said nothing and went back to her seat at the window.
"Mr. Heathcliff, why don't you leave Miss Cathy alone?"
Ellen asked, looking into his dark face.
"She's almost better now, and she's forgotten about you."
Heathcliff laughed. "Forgotten me? Ellen, say no more. I know you don't believe that," he said. "Every time Cathy thinks about Linton, she thinks 1,000 times about me. If Edgar Linton loved her with all the power of his weak little heart, he couldn't love her so much in 80 years as I can in one day. And Cathy's heart is as deep as mine. We're the same, she and I. She thinks about Edgar the way she does a pet animal, her dog, or her horse. Ellen, you've got to help me to see Catherine. I swear that I will not do anything to hurt her. I won't fight with Linton. I only want to see her. Last night I was in the garden at her house for 6 hours, and I will go there again tonight. I won't leave the place until I have seen her. I'll shoot anyone who tries to stop me. But you could help me do it quietly, Ellen. I would tell you before I came, and you could let me into the house. Then you could watch until I left. If you do this for me, no one will be hurt." Ellen knew that she did not have a choice. If she did not do what Heathcliff wanted, he would only hurt Edgar or someone else. So Ellen said she would take a letter from Heathcliff to Cathy. If Cathy wanted to see him, Ellen would let Heathcliff know when Edgar was not at home. Ellen did not give the letter to Cathy for 3 days. The 4th day was Sunday, and she gave the letter to Cathy when Edgar and the other servants were at church. Cathy was sitting by the window in her bedroom in a white dress. She had changed very much since her illness. Her eyes did not shine, and she did not laugh and talk as she used to. Instead, she was quiet, and her eyes were soft. As Ellen watched her look out the window, Cathy seemed to be looking at something that was far away, something that was not in this world.
"Miss Cathy, there's a letter for you,"
said Ellen.
"Now you must read it at once, because it needs an answer. Shall I open it?" "Yes,"
answered Cathy without even looking at it. Ellen opened it for her and saw that it was very short.
"Now,"
she said gently,
"read it. It's from Mr. Heathcliff."
Cathy looked shocked and quickly read the letter. She sighed but said nothing.
"He wants to see you,"
said Ellen.
"By this time he's waiting in the garden, and he will want to know your answer."
Suddenly they heard the sound of steps outside the room. Heathcliff was already coming in. Cathy stared at the door and tried to stand up. The door opened, and in a second Heathcliff had Cathy in his arms. For a long time the two did not speak. When Heathcliff looked into Cathy's face, Ellen knew he saw that she was dying. "Oh, Cathy, you are my life. How can I live without you?" Heathcliff cried in a voice Ellen had never heard from him before. Cathy held onto Heathcliff tightly, as if she never wanted to let him go.
"You and Edgar have broken my heart, Heathcliff," she cried. "You've killed me. Oh, how many years will you live after I'm gone? Probably hundreds."
"Catherine, don't say these things," Heathcliff cried. "How can you talk to me like that when you are dying? You should know that while you are at peace in heaven, I will be living here in the fires of hell without you."
"I won't be at peace,"
said Cathy.
"I won't be at peace in heaven when you can't be with me. I wish we would never be separated. Never, never."
Ellen had been staring out of the window, trying not to disturb Cathy and Heathcliff. Suddenly she saw Edgar opening the gate to the house and coming in.
"Heathcliff, Mr. Linton is here,"
she said.
"You must go quickly."
"Cathy, I must go," said Heathcliff.
"No, Heathcliff, not now. You can't."
There was a terrible look of fear in her eyes.
"Heathcliff, you must stay with me. It's the last time I will see you. I am afraid. I will die. I will die."
Heathcliff took her in his arms once more. "I'll stay, Cathy," he said, "even if he shoots me for it." Ellen heard Edgar begin to climb the stairs. He was almost at the door to Cathy's bedroom. Even though she was worried, Ellen was glad to see that Cathy was not holding Heathcliff so tightly any more. The door opened. For a terrible moment Edgar stood and looked at Cathy and Heathcliff together. Then his face became red with anger, and he ran towards Heathcliff. Cathy cried out and fainted. Heathcliff held on to Cathy so that she would not fall. "Linton, stop! Think of her," he said. "Help her first, and then you can deal with me." While Ellen and Edgar put Cathy into the bed, Heathcliff walked out of the room. When Cathy was awake again, Ellen begged Heathcliff to leave, telling him that Cathy was all right. "I'm staying in the garden tonight," Heathcliff said. "And remember, come and tell me how she is in the morning. Remember, or I'll come into the house again, and Linton can burn in hell." Chapter 9. A Child is Born. The beautiful young girl who Lockwood met at Wuthering Heights was born on that same night. The little baby was also named Catherine, like her mother. But about 2 hours after the child was born, her mother, the only person Heathcliff had ever loved, died in her sleep. The beautiful light of early morning came through the windows of Cathy's bedroom. Ellen was crying as she looked at Cathy's face. She looked more beautiful and peaceful than Ellen remembered. Edgar Linton was lying next to her, and his eyes were closed. After the sun had risen, Ellen left the room. She knew Heathcliff would be waiting in the garden for Ellen's message. Somehow, Ellen knew that Heathcliff already knew Cathy was dead. He was there in the garden, leaning against a tree. He raised his eyes and spoke. She's dead. I know. You don't need to tell me. And stop crying. She wants none of your tears. But Ellen was crying for him and his terrible loss. How did she die? He asked in that loud, cold voice. But Ellen saw that he was shaking. She felt so sorry for Heathcliff that she did not know what to do or say.
She died quietly and peacefully,
Ellen said.
There was a smile on her face when she went to sleep. She never woke up again.
Did she mention me? He asked. He was in great pain.
I'm so sorry, Heathcliff. She did not know anyone when she died, even me. I hope she will wake up as peacefully in heaven.
Peacefully? I hope she wakes up in the greatest pain, he cried. Where is she? She isn't in heaven. Catherine Linton, you will not rest as long as I am alive. You said I broke your heart, even killed you. Haunt me then. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me alone where I cannot find you. I cannot live without my life, and you are my life, Cathy. Suddenly he stopped speaking and told Ellen to go. She walked away quickly. She knew there was nothing she could do for him. They decided to bury Cathy on the next Friday. Her coffin sat in the living room during that week and was covered with flowers. Edgar spent his days and nights there, and Heathcliff spent his nights outside in the garden. Ellen did not see Heathcliff, but one night when Edgar had gone to sleep for a few hours, Ellen opened one of the windows so that Heathcliff could come into the living room and say goodbye to Cathy. Hindley Earnshaw, Cathy's brother, was asked to come to his sister's funeral, but he did not come. There were only a few people at the funeral besides Edgar and Ellen. Heathcliff did not come, and Edgar had not asked Isabella to attend the funeral. Cathy's grave was in a pretty place in the churchyard, with a simple stone above it with the name Catherine Linton. During that month, Thrushcross Grange was a sad, quiet house. Ellen sat alone in the sitting-room with little Catherine, Edgar's daughter. Edgar stayed in his room and his library. While Ellen cared for the baby, she watched the snow fall on the cold ground. She did not do anything else for many days. And then, one evening, the door opened and a young girl entered, running into the room and laughing loudly. Ellen was angry because she thought it was a servant girl.
What are you doing, girl? You'll bother Mr. Linton and wake up the baby. Be quiet. I'm sorry,
the girl said.
But I can't stop myself from laughing.
The voice was Isabella's. Ellen turned and stared at the girl. Her thin dress was wet, and she wore small, dirty shoes on her feet. Her pale face was full of cuts and bruises. Isabella ran to the fire to get warm.
I've run here from Wuthering Heights,
she said.
I'm hurting all over. Ellen, please tell a servant to find me some new clothes and ask a carriage to take me to Gimmerton. You're not going to Gimmerton tonight,
said Ellen.
You're too cold and wet, Isabella. Yes, I am, even if I have to walk,
said Isabella.
I must have some dry clothes.
Ellen could see Isabella would go to Gimmerton no matter what she said. So she helped Isabella get ready to go, and soon Isabella was sitting in a chair by the fire drinking a hot cup of tea.
I'm sorry I laughed, Ellen,
Isabella said.
Please don't think that I didn't care about poor Cathy. She and I did not agree about Heathcliff, and I thought she treated my brother very badly. But I can't forgive myself for not writing to her. But that's over now. And now I'm going to throw away the last thing of Heathcliff's that I have. I will never go back to him.
Isabella took a wedding ring on her finger and dropped it onto the floor.
I'll smash the ring,
she cried.
And then I'll throw it into the fire.
She tried to break the ring with her feet, and then threw it into the fire. She was laughing and crying at the same time.
Isabella, calm down,
said Ellen.
So you have finally realized the truth about Heathcliff. You've run away from him. What will you do now? I'll go anywhere,
Isabella said.
as long as it's far away from him. No, he's not a man. He's a monster.
Isabella told Ellen how that night Hindley and Heathcliff had been in a terrible fight. Hindley had tried to shoot Heathcliff with a gun, but Heathcliff had fought Hindley with a knife. When Isabella tried to protect Hindley, Heathcliff had cut her with the knife. Isabella had told him that she would rather die than stay with him, and left immediately. Ellen felt sad for Isabella.
My dear,
She said gently,
do not think that Heathcliff is really an evil man. He has a terrible character, and has had a very hard life. Catherine was the only person he ever loved, but they could never marry and be together. Now she is dead, and a part of Heathcliff is dead too. Ellen, don't tell me these things.
Isabella said.
I don't care, and I don't want to hear them. I only want to leave here forever.
Then Isabella stood up, put on her coat, and went outside where the carriage was waiting for her. Like she promised Ellen, Isabella never returned to that part of the country again. However, many months later, Ellen heard that Isabella was living in the south of England near London. Isabella had a new baby son named Linton. She wrote a letter to Edgar about the child, saying that he was small and got sick easily. One day Ellen saw Heathcliff in the village, and he asked her where Isabella had gone. She would not tell him because she was afraid he would force Isabella and the baby to come back to Wuthering Heights. However, he found out the truth and knew where Isabella lived and about his new son. After that, whenever he saw Ellen, he asked about the baby. When he heard the baby's name, he laughed loudly and said, "Oh, so she wants me to hate the baby because it's a Linton, does she? Well, I'll have him when I want him. She can be sure of that." After the death of his wife, Edgar Linton lived alone. He spent his time inside his house and only went out to visit his wife's grave. But Edgar could not stay very unhappy for long. He did not want Catherine's ghost to haunt him, and he had a little daughter to love. Little Cathy looked like her mother, and this made him happy. When Hindley died, no one was surprised. He died soon after his sister, very drunk. He was only 27 years old. Wuthering Heights became Heathcliff's house, since Hindley had lost all the money that he owned. It was strange that the poor gypsy boy, who had once been almost a servant, now owned the great house. And Hareton Earnshaw, Hindley's son, was a servant in his own father's house. Ellen felt afraid when she realized these things. She knew that Hareton did not know what Heathcliff had done. Heathcliff's revenge on the Earnshaw family was not finished yet. Book 3. The Second Catherine. Chapter 1. Heathcliff's Son. 12 years passed. These years were happy ones for Ellen Dean. The second Catherine, Edgar's daughter, was very beautiful and looked like her dead mother. However, she was not like Cathy Linton in other ways. Little Cathy did not go outside the limits of Thrushcross Grange by herself. Sometimes Edgar took her for a walk, but he would not let her go out with anyone else. Sometimes she would stand at one of the windows and ask Ellen,
How long will it be before I can walk to the top of those hills, Ellen? Can I go there when I am a woman? Perhaps, Miss Cathy.
Ellen always answered,
But your father will tell you that.
When little Cathy was 13, Edgar Linton got a letter from Isabella. She told him that she had been sick for a long time, and she knew she did not have very long to live. Isabella asked Edgar to take care of her son Linton. When Edgar read this sad letter, he went to Isabella at once. He was gone for 3 weeks, and during this time young Cathy walked around the gardens. Often Cathy rode her little horse for many hours. But one day in July she did not come back at her usual time. Ellen was worried and finally went to look for her. She walked until she could see Wuthering Heights, but she still could not find Cathy. She ran up to the house and knocked on the door. A servant came to the door.
"Oh,"
she said.
"you're looking for the young girl, aren't you? She's here, so don't worry. Mr. Heathcliff is out somewhere with Joseph."
Ellen found Cathy sitting in a little chair that had once been her mother's. She was laughing and talking to Hareton, who was now 18 years old. Hareton was looking at Cathy as if she were a beautiful princess. He had never met anyone like her before. Ellen was happy to see Cathy and Hareton together, but she knew she had to act angry.
"Catherine Linton, you naughty girl. Why did you stay out for so long without telling me?"
Cathy jumped up and ran to her.
"Oh, Ellen,"
she laughed.
"you found me. Have you ever been to this house before?"
Ellen didn't want to answer that.
"Come home with me right now,"
she said. She was afraid that Heathcliff would suddenly come home. But Cathy started to dance around the room. Hareton and the servant laughed.
"Miss Cathy,"
said Ellen very seriously,
"if you knew whose house this is, you'd run away as fast as you could."
Young Cathy turned to Hareton.
"This is your father's house, isn't it?"
she asked. Hareton's face turned red. "No," he said. He did not look at anyone.
"Whose house is this, then? Is it your master's?"
Hareton looked upset and turned away from Cathy.
"Oh, I thought you were the owner's son,"
said Cathy.
"You should have told me you were only a servant. Now get me my horse."
"Get it yourself. I'm not your slave," the boy said. He added, "You little witch." Ellen had to stop herself from laughing.
"How dare you speak to me like that?"
Cathy cried.
"I'll tell my father."
She turned to the woman.
"You get my horse,"
she said.
"It's not my job to do what you say."
said the woman.
"And be careful what you say to Mr. Hareton. He may not be the master's son, but he's your cousin, young lady."
Cathy laughed.
"He's not my cousin. Don't let her say these things, Ellen. Father's gone to get my cousin from London. He's a gentleman's son." "Miss Cathy,"
Ellen whispered.
"people can have many cousins."
Cathy looked like she did not understand.
"But Ellen, he's not my cousin. We don't know him."
Then she ran out the door. Hareton seemed upset, but he went and found Cathy's little horse and brought it to the door. On the way home, Ellen tried to tell Cathy some of the truth. She told Cathy that her father Edgar did not like the people at Wuthering Heights, and he would be very upset to find out that Cathy had been there. Ellen and Cathy decided not to tell him about Cathy's adventure. When they got back to Thrushcross Grange, there was a letter waiting for them. It was from Edgar, and they learned that Isabella was dead. Edgar told Ellen to find a room for Linton, Cathy's young cousin. Cathy was very happy that her father was coming back. She was also excited to meet her cousin Linton. It was night when Edgar and Linton arrived home. Cathy ran out of the house and threw her arms around her father. When Ellen saw young Linton, she thought to herself,
"Why, this boy could be Edgar's son. He looks so much like his uncle."
After they all had tea, Ellen took Linton upstairs to his room and waited until he was asleep. Then she went downstairs again. She was lighting a candle for Mr. Edgar's bedroom when a maid told her that Mr. Heathcliff's servant Joseph was at the door.
"Joseph wants to speak to Mr. Edgar,"
said the maid. Ellen had a feeling that she knew the reason why. She was terribly worried.
"I don't think the master can see him now,"
she said.
"I'll speak to him."
Joseph walked into the hall as she spoke. "I want to see Edgar Linton," he said.
"He's going to bed now,"
answered Ellen. Joseph did not listen to her. "Where is his room?" he asked. Ellen told him to wait and went to the library to tell Edgar that Joseph was there. But Joseph was behind Ellen in the hall and went into the room. When he saw Edgar sitting in front of the fire, he said in a loud, angry voice, "Heathcliff has sent me to bring his son to Wuthering Heights, and says that I can't go back without him." Chapter 2. Father and Son. Edgar's face was full of sadness, but he knew that Linton's father had every reason to ask for his son. There was nothing he could do to stop Heathcliff, even if he did not want Linton to live at Wuthering Heights. Edgar said calmly, "Tell Mr. Heathcliff that Linton will come to his father's house tomorrow. He is sleeping now, and he is too tired to travel tonight." When Ellen woke up Linton early in the morning, he was very surprised to learn that he was going to spend some time with his father. "Mother never told me that I had a father," he said. "Where does he live? I think I want to stay here with Uncle Edgar."
"Your father lives close to here,"
said Ellen.
"When you are stronger, you can walk over and see us."
"It's strange that I've never seen my father," he said once. "I don't remember anything about him." Ellen looked at Linton's face when they arrived at Wuthering Heights that morning. She knew that Linton did not like the way the house looked, but he did not say anything. It was early morning, and the family had just finished breakfast. Joseph and Heathcliff were talking, and Hareton was getting ready to work in the fields. "Hello, Ellen," said Heathcliff. "So you've brought the boy, have you? Let me look at him." He got up and walked to the door. Hareton and Joseph followed him. Poor little Linton stood and looked at the three large men. Ellen could see that he was very frightened. He held on to Ellen tightly. "Get him something to eat," Heathcliff said. Then he said to Linton, "Don't look so frightened, boy. We're not going to hurt you. You are Isabella's child, aren't you? Do you know who I am?" "No." "That's too bad for you. Your mother was stupid not to tell you about your father. Now, don't cry. Be a good boy, and do as I say, and I'll take care of you. Ellen, you'd better go."
"I hope you'll be kind to the boy,"
said Ellen.
"He's the only person you have in the world."
"I'll be very kind to him," Heathcliff said. "My son will be the owner of this place one day, and I wouldn't want anything to happen to him." When Linton was not looking, Ellen left the house. As she closed the door, she heard him cry out, "Don't leave me! I can't stay here!" When young Cathy learned that her cousin was already gone, she cried because she had wanted to play with him. The months passed. When Ellen met the servants from Wuthering Heights, she asked them how Linton was doing. They told her that Linton was always sick and had pains of some kind. Mr. Heathcliff did not seem to like his son, although he tried to hide his feelings. 3 years went by, and Cathy was now 16 years old. Cathy's birthdays were not very happy days, since her mother had died on the day she was born. Edgar always spent that day alone, so Cathy had to play by herself. The day of Cathy's 16th birthday was a beautiful spring day. Cathy ran downstairs and told Ellen that her father had said they could go outside for a walk on the moors. They began to walk. Cathy ran most of the way in front and took Ellen down a long road. At last, Ellen began to get tired. It was time, she thought, to stop walking and go home. She shouted to Cathy to stop, but the girl was a long way in front and did not hear. Ellen saw Cathy disappear around a corner. When Ellen saw her again, she was close to Wuthering Heights. She was talking to two men, and one of them was Heathcliff. Heathcliff had seen Cathy taking some eggs that were on Heathcliff's land. When Ellen approached, he was talking to Cathy as if she were a thief.
"I'm not a thief,"
said Cathy to Heathcliff.
"Father told me there were birds' nests here, and I wanted to see them."
Heathcliff gave Ellen a strange smile. "And who," he asked, "is father?"
"My father is Mr. Edgar Linton, sir,"
replied Cathy.
"I thought you didn't know me, or else you wouldn't have spoken in that way."
She nodded to Hareton, who stood close by.
"I've seen him before,"
she said.
"Is he your son?"
"No, he's not my son," answered Heathcliff. "But I do have a son, and you've met him before, too. Don't you think both you and Ellen should rest a little? You can come to my house. It's close to here." Quickly Ellen said,
"Miss Cathy, your father wants you to come home immediately." "Why?"
asked Cathy.
"Let's go to Wuthering Heights. That's where you live, isn't it, sir? I want to see your son."
"Of course you can see my son." "Be quiet, Ellen Dean," said Heathcliff. "The girl doesn't go outside enough. Ellen, walk with me." Cathy was already running ahead, and she was almost at the door. Ellen was angry, but she had no choice but to follow Heathcliff. Heathcliff ran up the path to open the door for Cathy. Ellen noticed that he smiled when he looked into Cathy's eyes, and his voice was soft when he spoke to her. Linton was standing by the fireplace. Ellen saw that he had grown tall. He was a thin but handsome boy. "Linton," said Heathcliff, "do you remember your cousin, Cathy?" Cathy looked happy.
"Is that Linton?"
she said.
"Why, he's taller than I am. I'm so glad to see you, Linton."
The boy ran to her, and she gave him a kiss. Heathcliff stood watching them with a strange smile.
"Are you my uncle, then?"
Cathy asked Heathcliff.
"I like you, I think, though you were angry at first. Why don't you and Linton ever come to see me?"
"I should tell you the truth," said Heathcliff calmly. "Your father doesn't like me. We have been enemies for a long time, and if you tell him you have been here to see me, he won't let you come again." Cathy cried.
"Why are you enemies, Uncle? What happened?"
"Your father thought I was too poor to marry his sister," answered Heathcliff sadly. "But I married her anyway, and he never forgave me for it."
"He shouldn't think that way,"
said Cathy.
"I'll tell him when I see him again. And Linton and I aren't enemies. Why can't he come visit me at home?"
"I don't think I can walk that far," said Linton, "but you could visit me here sometimes." Heathcliff looked at his son. "Take your cousin into the garden," he said, "and take care of her." The two went outside, and Mr. Heathcliff told a servant to make Ellen some tea. He seemed very happy that Linton and Cathy were together. Ellen and Cathy stayed for more than an hour. When they walked home, Ellen tried to tell Cathy the truth about Heathcliff and the kind of person he was, but the girl did not believe it.
"Oh, Ellen, you worry too much. I don't think my uncle is so terrible, and I'll talk to Father about it tomorrow."
The next day Cathy told her father about the visit.
"Father,"
she said,
"why didn't you tell me that my cousin Linton lived so near? Is it because you do not like Mr. Heathcliff?"
"No," he answered quietly. "I did not tell you because Mr. Heathcliff does not like me or my family. He's a truly terrible man, my dear, and he will do anything to hurt people he does not like. I promise you, Cathy, stay away from him and his house." Cathy nodded, but Ellen could see that she did not really believe this.
"But, Father, he was very friendly,"
she said.
"He told me that I could visit them whenever I wanted. He wants me to be friends with Linton, and you do not."
Edgar had to make his daughter understand. Quickly he told Cathy how Heathcliff had treated Isabella and how Wuthering Heights had become his property. When Cathy heard this, she was very surprised. "Now, Cathy, you understand why I don't want you to go to Heathcliff's house," said Edgar. "Don't think about them any more." Cathy kissed her father and promised to do what he said. But in the evening, when Ellen went to her room, she found the girl sitting sadly in her room.
"What's wrong, Miss Cathy?"
Ellen asked.
"Poor Linton!"
Cathy cried.
"I like him so much. He wanted to see me again tomorrow, and he'll be so sad. He'll wait for me, and I won't come."
Chapter 3. A Message from Heathcliff. Summer ended, and autumn came. Edgar became sick and stayed in his room all winter. Poor Cathy was left alone. One wet, cold afternoon in November, Cathy asked Ellen to walk with her outside. Ellen did not want to go, but she thought she should watch Cathy. Cathy walked sadly and silently along. It was clear to Ellen that she was worried about her father, who was very sick. Soon Ellen and Cathy came to a wall with a little door in it. Cathy seemed a little happier and climbed up the wall and sat on top. Then she jumped down on the other side to pick some pretty flowers. However, Cathy found that she could not climb back up the wall because it was too smooth.
"Ellen,"
she cried,
"you'll have to go and get the key. I can't climb on the wall." "All right,"
Ellen answered,
"but stay where you are."
She was about to walk back to the house when she heard a horse coming down the road. Soon the horse stopped where Cathy was standing. "Hello, Miss Linton," cried a deep voice that Ellen knew. "What a surprise to see you."
"Mr. Heathcliff, I am sorry. I can't speak to you,"
Cathy said firmly.
"My father says you are a bad man."
"Well, it's not true," Heathcliff said. "I want to talk to you about my son. 2 or 3 months ago you wrote him many letters. Did you grow tired of writing and stop? Well, Linton is miserable now. He was really in love with you, and now he's sick because he wants to see you so much. He'll die before this summer unless you help him." Ellen could keep quiet no longer. She ran back to the wall and shouted,
"Heathcliff, don't tell the girl these lies. Miss Cathy, don't believe anything he says."
"Oh, so there you are, Ellen. I was wondering when you would speak up," said Heathcliff. "Well, just go to Wuthering Heights and see if I'm telling the truth, Catherine. I shall be away from home all this week. Go and see Linton, just for a little while. You'll save him." While he was speaking, Ellen was able to break the lock on the door in the wall with a stone. When the door was open, she ran out to the other side of the wall, where Cathy and Heathcliff stood. "Listen, I promise you that Linton is dying," Heathcliff said, giving Ellen a hard look. "Cathy, he dreams of you day and night, and thinks that you are angry at him since you never write or visit."
"Come inside, Miss Cathy. It's time to go home,"
said Ellen firmly. She almost dragged her through the door in the wall. When they were home, Cathy went to her father's room to see him, but he had fallen asleep. When she came downstairs, she asked Ellen to sit with her in the library. For a while the two sat there quietly. Ellen was sewing and Cathy was reading a book by the fire. After a little while, Ellen saw that Cathy was crying. Ellen let her cry for a time and then said gently,
"Dear, don't worry about Linton. I don't believe Heathcliff was telling you the truth. I'm sure Linton is all right." "You might be right, Ellen,"
she said brokenly.
"but I will never rest until I know."
Finally, she convinced Ellen to go with her to Wuthering Heights. Cathy rode her little gray horse, and Ellen walked beside her. When they arrived at Wuthering Heights, Ellen went into the kitchen to make sure that Heathcliff was really gone. No one was there, but she heard a voice call out from another room. "Joseph, make a fire." It was Linton. Cathy heard her cousin's voice and ran to him. "Father told me you would come. Oh, Cathy!" Ellen made a fire while the two cousins talked.
"Well, Linton,"
Cathy said,
"are you glad to see me?"
"Yes, I am. But you should have come to see me before. Don't you like me any more, Cathy?"
"Yes, next to Father and Ellen, I love you best,"
Cathy said.
"I don't like your father, Mr. Heathcliff, though. And I don't want to come here when he's at home. Will he be gone for long?"
"No," Linton answered, "but he often leaves the house in winter. You could visit me when he's not here."
"If my father would let me, I'd spend a lot of time with you,"
said Cathy.
"I wish you lived at my house."
"Cathy, will you come tomorrow?" Linton asked.
"No, she won't,"
said Ellen firmly.
"And she won't come the next day either. Her father will not allow it."
But Cathy whispered something in Linton's ear, something that made his pale face look happier. Cathy and Ellen were home in time for dinner. Ellen had gotten very wet and cold in the terrible weather, and for the next 3 weeks she was sick with a cold and had to stay in bed. Cathy was very worried about Ellen and was a very good nurse. She was always with her father and Ellen while they were sick. At the end of 3 weeks, Ellen was able to leave her room. That night, she asked Cathy to read to her because her eyes felt weak. Cathy immediately picked up a book, but she sounded as if she did not want to read.
"I'm so tired, Ellen,"
she kept saying.
"Stop reading then, and talk to me instead,"
answered Ellen. That seemed to make things worse. Cathy kept looking at the clock on the wall while she was talking. Finally, it was 8 o'clock, and Cathy went up to her room quickly. The next night she told Ellen that she had a headache and went up to her room immediately after tea. Ellen knew Cathy was acting strangely. After a while she went up to the girl's room to see if she was better. Cathy was not in her bedroom, and she was not anywhere else in the house. Ellen did not know what to do, and she did not want to upset Edgar by telling him. So she sat down in Cathy's room to wait. The moon was shining brightly, and the snow covered the ground. Finally, Ellen saw Cathy leading her horse into the stable and walking into the house. When Cathy entered her room, she took off her coat and boots. Suddenly, Ellen stood up and spoke.
"My dear Miss Cathy, may I ask where you have been so late at night?"
Cathy jumped up, surprised.
"Ellen, what are you doing here?" "I've only been riding around the property,"
Cathy said slowly.
"And you haven't been anywhere else?"
asked Ellen.
"No,"
said Cathy, but she did not look at Ellen.
"Catherine Linton,"
said Ellen.
"I want you to tell me the truth."
At this, Cathy began to cry.
"I've been to Wuthering Heights,"
she said.
"And I've been there every day that you've been sick. Ellen, I just had to see Linton." Mr. Heathcliff doesn't bother me. I haven't even seen him at all. I can't be stopped from going to the Heights, Ellen. You won't tell my father, will you? Please don't tell him. I'll think about that in the morning,
Ellen replied.
I'll leave you now.
Ellen did think about the matter with Edgar. She decided that she had to tell him the whole story. Edgar was very upset. In the morning he told Cathy that her visits to Linton must stop. Edgar told Cathy that he would write to Linton and tell him that he could come to the Grange whenever he wanted, but that he would no longer see Cathy at Wuthering Heights. Chapter 4. A Closed Door. Edgar spoke to Ellen a few days later. He looked sick and worried. "Ellen," he said, "I wish Linton would write or visit. Tell me, what do you think of him?"
Well, sir, he is very much like Isabella, but he is not much like his father in any way that I can see.
Edgar sighed and walked to the window. "What can I do for Cathy?" he asked. "It seems that she loves her cousin Linton. You know that when I die, Linton will get Thrushcross Grange, since he is the only member of my family left. Cathy will have her own money, but who will take care of my daughter? What will I do?"
I don't know, sir.
Ellen replied.
I don't know what will happen.
Spring passed, and the warmer weather came, but Edgar was still sick. He wrote again to Linton and asked him to visit. He received an answer from Linton that said that Heathcliff would not let him visit Thrushcross Grange. "Uncle, please let Cathy come here," he wrote. "I really want to see her again." Even though he felt sorry for Linton, Edgar could not agree to this, because he was too sick to go with Cathy to the Heights. Finally, Cathy convinced her father to let her go out with Ellen and meet Linton on the moors. Ellen did not want to go. She had a feeling that something bad was going to happen. It was summer when they went. They left Edgar sick in bed and rode off through the beautiful summer day. Cathy's face was like the land around her, with shadows and sunshine moving over it quickly. They saw Linton less than a mile from Wuthering Heights, lying on the grass. He moved so slowly and looked so pale that Ellen said,
Master Linton, how sick you look. You shouldn't be outside.
No, I'm better, much better, he said. But he did not look better. He held on to Cathy's hand as if he needed her to help him stand up. He seemed better when Cathy sat down with him. But Ellen noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder as if he was waiting for someone to come. Ellen was wondering what was wrong when she looked up and saw a man coming from Wuthering Heights. It was Heathcliff. He walked straight up to Ellen. "Ellen, how are you at the Grange?" "They tell me," he added in a lower voice, "that Edgar Linton is very sick. Is this true?"
Yes,
Ellen said.
My master is dying.
Heathcliff looked happy. He looked at the two young people who were standing still, afraid of him. "And how is Linton today? Is he enjoying himself with pretty young Miss Linton?"
No,
said Ellen.
He's not. He should be in bed. Heathcliff, a doctor should see him.
"He will be in bed in a day or two," Heathcliff said softly. "But first, get up, Linton. Get up this moment," he shouted. He tried to grab the boy, but Linton held on to Cathy, begging her not to leave him. The boy seemed so afraid that Ellen could not say no. The whole party walked toward the Heights. When they got there, Cathy went in with Linton and Ellen stood still, waiting for her to come outside again. Suddenly Heathcliff was behind her. "My house isn't cursed, Ellen," he said. "Come in and sit down, and let me shut the door." When Ellen was inside the house, she heard a soft noise. She turned around and stared at Heathcliff. What she saw made her angry and afraid. Heathcliff had not only shut the door, he had locked it. Chapter 5. Trapped. Heathcliff smiled at Ellen. His eyes had a cold look in them. "You shall have tea with me, Ellen," he said. "I am alone for the moment. Miss Linton, sit next to him. Look how the girl stares at me." Suddenly his face changed. He turned away from them, and Ellen heard him say to himself, "By hell, how I hate these Linton people."
"I'm not afraid of you, you know,"
said Cathy. She stepped closer to him, her eyes flashing with anger.
"You give me that key and let us go home,"
she said.
"I wouldn't eat or drink in this house if I were starving."
Heathcliff had the key in his hand. Cathy tried to grab the key from him. "Get away," Heathcliff cried, "or I'll knock you down. You will see that I know how to deal with people I don't like, especially children," he said. "Go and sit with Linton now, as I told you. I will be your father tomorrow. I'll be the only father you'll have in a few days, and then I'll deal with you, my girl, I promise you that. You'll see my whip if you talk to me like that again." Cathy ran to Ellen, and the two tried to comfort each other. Heathcliff made the tea himself. When it was ready, he poured out the tea and handed Ellen a cup. "Drink it," he said. "It's not poison. I'm going to get your horses." When Heathcliff had gone outside, Ellen's first thought was to find a way to escape. But all the doors were locked, and the windows were too small to crawl through. They were trapped at Wuthering Heights until Heathcliff decided to let them go. Ellen turned to Linton.
"Now listen here, young Linton. You know what your father wants with us,"
she said firmly.
"Tell me what is happening right now, or you'll be sorry." "Yes, Linton, you must tell us,"
said Cathy.
"I came here to see you, you know."
"He wants us to be married," answered Linton softly. "He's planned everything. He's going to keep you here tonight, and if you do as he wants, you can go home the next day and take me with you." Cathy and Ellen did not know what to say. Soon Heathcliff came back. "Your horses have left," he said. "Now, Linton, you can go to bed. I won't hurt you. You don't have to be afraid. You haven't done so badly after all." He held the door open for his son. Then he went to the fire, where Ellen and Cathy stood in silence. Cathy looked at him and did not look away. He said angrily, "So you're still not afraid of me?"
"Yes,"
she said quickly.
"I am afraid. Because if you keep me here, my father will be miserable and worried about me. Mr. Heathcliff, please, let me go home. Don't do this to my father. I promise that I'll marry Linton."
"I'll see that you do," he said. "You won't leave this house until you do. As for your father, I shall enjoy myself thinking of his misery."
"Why? What has he done to you? Please, think of me. Let me go,"
cried Cathy desperately. She grabbed his hand, but Heathcliff took it away. "Don't touch me, girl, or you'll be sorry," he said. "I'd rather be touched by a snake. I hate you and your family. Now be quiet. I don't want to hear anything more from you." After it was dark, they heard voices at the gate. Heathcliff ran out to see whom it was. He talked with someone for 2 or 3 minutes, and then he came back. Those people were servants from Thrushcross Grange. They were looking for you. He smiled. Now go upstairs to my housekeeper's room. She won't be here tonight. Ellen whispered to Cathy to do what he told them. Neither of them slept that night. They both sat on chairs and waited anxiously for the morning. At 7 o'clock, Heathcliff came to the door and called for Cathy.
Yes?
She answered and ran to the door. Come on, he said, opening it and pulling her out. Ellen rose to follow, but he closed the door and locked it before she could leave. She banged on the door and called out, but no one came to help her. She stayed there for many hours until Zillah, the housekeeper, whom Lockwood had met, came and opened the door. Ellen ran down the stairs. The house seemed very quiet. Linton was lying on the couch in the sitting room, but Ellen did not see Cathy anywhere.
Linton, where's Miss Cathy?
Ellen demanded. Linton smiled, but the smile was not a nice one. She's my wife now, he said. She's upstairs locked in, and my father says she can't go home yet.
You could get hold of the key if you wanted to,
Ellen said. Yes, but I'm not going to, he answered. I don't want to. Ellen wanted to slap him, but she knew this would do no good. She decided to go to the Grange and send someone to rescue Cathy. When she arrived at the house, she ran straight up to Edgar's room. How different he looked! He looked like a ghost. He was lying in bed and whispered Cathy's name. Ellen touched his hand.
Cathy's coming, Mr. Edgar,
she whispered.
She's alive and well, and will be here soon.
She told him a little about what had happened. Then she went downstairs and told 4 of the men to go to Wuthering Heights and bring Cathy back with them. She was extremely worried and angry when the men returned without Cathy. They told her that Cathy was sick and Heathcliff would not let them see her. That night Ellen watched Edgar. About 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a loud knock at the front door. When she opened it, Cathy was there in the clear moonlight.
Thank God you're here, Miss Cathy,
Ellen cried.
Is my father still alive? Linton helped me to escape,
Cathy said as they ran to Edgar's room. Ellen waited for an hour before going into the room where Cathy and her father were. Cathy sat holding her father's hands, her eyes fixed on his face. He looked happy and at peace, and Ellen knew that he was dead. Chapter 6. The Master of the House. Cathy was in her father's room for many hours, but finally Ellen made her go to her room and sleep. That same evening, Mr. Green, the lawyer, visited the Grange. He had a letter from Heathcliff, who was taking Thrushcross Grange for his son Linton. Heathcliff told all the servants that they could go, except for Ellen Dean. He said that he would come to Thrushcross Grange very soon. Catherine was allowed to stay in her home until her father's funeral was over. On the evening after the funeral, Cathy and Ellen were sitting in the library when they heard someone coming. Then Heathcliff walked into the room and shut the door behind him. Cathy stood up when she saw him and was going to leave the room, but Heathcliff grabbed her arm. "Stop," he said harshly. "Don't go away. I've come to take you back to your husband. I hope you'll be a good daughter and not tell my son to disobey me. I don't care if you like your husband or not. You will come. He's your problem now."
Why can't she stay here?
asked Ellen.
Your son could live here too.
Heathcliff stared at her as if she was stupid. "I'm going to find someone to come and live at the Grange," he said. "And I want my happy children around me. Now get ready to go."
"I will,"
Cathy replied.
"I know Linton loves me, and he is all I have to love in the world. But nobody loves you. Nobody will cry when you die. I'm happy I'm not you."
"Girl, I'll knock you dead if you stand there talking another minute," said her father-in-law fiercely. "Get ready to go." Cathy came to Ellen and kissed her. Her lips felt like ice, and she was shaking.
"Goodbye, Ellen,"
she said, trying to sound cheerful.
"Come and visit me sometimes."
"No," said Heathcliff loudly. "Ellen, I don't want you at my house. When I wish to speak to you, I'll come here." He told Cathy to go out. She obeyed, but when she stopped at the door, she gave Ellen a look that broke Ellen's heart. Ellen watched the two people walk down the garden. Cathy did not try to run away, although Heathcliff was almost dragging her away from the house. For many months, Ellen did not see Cathy. Once she tried to go to the Heights, but Joseph would not let her go in. Only the housekeeper Zillah told Ellen about Cathy when they met. Ellen learned that Cathy had cared for Linton for many weeks before he died. After Linton's funeral, Cathy did not leave her room for 2 weeks. During this time she had changed. The sweet young girl whom Ellen had known was gone. Cathy had turned angry and hard, like the girl Lockwood met. She was not afraid of Heathcliff, and she fought with him and Hareton. The more she was hurt, the angrier and more hurtful to others she became. She lived in a world of bad feelings. This was the house that Lockwood had come to on that cold winter day. Book 4, House of Happiness. Chapter 1. Return to Wuthering Heights. You will now begin to see why I, William Lockwood, who now lives at Thrushcross Grange, have told my story in these 4 different parts. This has not been an easy story to tell, because I met Cathy, Hareton, and Heathcliff when they were adults. I did not know the first Catherine Earnshaw, or the Heathcliff of many years ago. I first came to Yorkshire long after many of the people in the story were dead. I understood Catherine Earnshaw through Ellen Dean's eyes. She knew the first Catherine well, and I could see her in my mind. But I did see and meet the daughter of Catherine Earnshaw. I did speak with Heathcliff, you remember. I did sit at the table with Hareton Earnshaw during my visit to Wuthering Heights, the grey house that is always in the story. I met all these unhappy people at Wuthering Heights, which I have called a house of hatred. And how does the story end? Is there more to it? Yes, there is. And the end is a happy one. Let me tell you what happened. You remember that I came to Yorkshire and met Heathcliff during the winter of 1801. I wanted to live at Thrushcross Grange for at least 2 years, but before the winter was over, I had to go to London on some very important business. I stayed in London until September of 1802, when a friend asked me to spend some time at a friend's house who lived in the north of England. That September, I was traveling to my friend's house when I stopped at an inn. A man was giving my horse some water to drink when a carriage passed by. "That carriage is going to Gimmerton," he casually remarked. I gave a start. "Gimmerton?" I said. "How far away is that?" "About 14 miles away from here," he said. Suddenly I wanted to go back to Thrushcross Grange. I was still renting the house, and I wanted to spend the night there. I reached the Grange and knocked at the door. No one came out, so I walked around to the back of the house. A woman I did not know was sitting on the porch. "Is Mrs. Ellen Dean here?" I asked.
"No,"
she answered.
"She's living at Wuthering Heights now. I'm the housekeeper here for now."
"Well, I'm Mr. Lockwood, the master. I'm going to stay here the night." She looked at me in surprise.
"I never knew you were coming here, sir,"
she said.
"I'll have to get your room ready."
She went into the house, and I followed her. I knew she would need some time to cook a meal, so I told her I would go out for a walk while I was waiting. I wanted to go to Wuthering Heights and talk to Ellen Dean. The moon was in the sky as I walked past the lonely churchyard where Catherine Earnshaw was buried. Suddenly, standing on the road, I saw a little boy crying terribly. "What's the matter, boy?" I asked him. "I saw that Heathcliff and a lady walking there," he said. "I always see them. I'm afraid to pass them." I looked into the churchyard, but I saw nothing. I did not understand what the boy was afraid of, so I told him to hurry home and continued to walk. When I reached Wuthering Heights, a beautiful moon was shining in the sky. As I opened the gate and walked towards the door, the sweet smell of flowers was in the air. All the doors and windows were thrown wide open. As I came near, I heard a man and a woman talking.
"Contrary,"
said a voice as sweet as a bird's.
"That's how you say it. I'm not going to tell you again. Remember it, or I'll pull your hair."
There was a sound of laughter. "Contrary," said the man's voice. "And now kiss me for remembering so well." I looked into an open window. There was a young man, handsome and well-dressed, sitting at the table with a book. I saw that it was Hareton Earnshaw, and next to him was the beautiful young Catherine, the first Cathy's daughter. She smiled and laughed happily. I saw that Cathy was teaching Hareton to read, and they were both in love with each other. Then I went to the kitchen door. Ellen Dean was sitting outside in the moonlight. When she saw me, she jumped to her feet.
"Mr. Lockwood, we haven't seen you for a long time."
"How are you, Ellen? I'm surprised to see you here."
"Well, sir, Zillah had to leave, and Mr. Heathcliff wanted me to come back here after you went to London."
"I would like to speak to Heathcliff about the rent money for Thrushcross Grange. Is he here?"
"Oh,"
Ellen said.
"You can talk to me about the money. I make some decisions here now."
I looked at Ellen in amazement, and suddenly she put a hand over her mouth.
"Oh, dear,"
she said.
"You don't know about Heathcliff. He is dead."
"Heathcliff is dead?" I asked her. I remembered the little boy I had met by the churchyard, who said that he had seen Heathcliff and a woman walking in the dark. "When did he die?" I asked her.
3 months ago,"
said Ellen.
"Come in, and I'll tell you about it. Have you had anything to eat, Mr. Lockwood?"
"That's all right. I asked for dinner at Thrushcross Grange," I said. Ellen and I had a cup of tea while she told me the story. Chapter 2. The End of Unhappiness. It had taken some time for Cathy and Hareton to fall in love. As you know, Cathy was very unhappy when she first came to live at Wuthering Heights after Edgar's death. Hareton did not like Cathy. and all she did was say unkind things to him. But after Ellen arrived at the house, she watched Cathy's face when Hareton was around. Sometimes Ellen believed that Cathy had more feelings for Hareton than she wanted to say. During that time, Heathcliff seemed to grow more and more angry and cruel. At the beginning of March, his gun exploded while he was out on the hills alone, and a piece of metal cut his arm. He could not leave the house for some days. One day Hareton was sitting by the window, and Cathy was sitting by the fire. At last Ellen heard her speak to Hareton.
"Hareton,"
she said,
"I think that I really do like you now."
Hareton said angrily, "Leave me alone. You are making fun of me. You always do."
"No, I'm not,"
said Cathy softly.
"Not any more. You know, you are my cousin. We should be friends, Hareton. I'm sorry that I've hurt you."
"I don't want to be friends with you," Hareton said. Then Ellen decided to speak.
"You should be friends with your cousin, Mr. Hareton,"
she called from the kitchen.
"You'll become a fine gentleman if you have her for a friend."
"She's not a friend of mine," said Hareton. "I always make Heathcliff angry when I defend her, and all she does is laugh at me."
"Forgive me, Hareton,"
said Cathy gently.
"I'm so very sorry now."
Ellen looked through the door at that moment and saw Cathy put out her hand. Hareton scowled, but Cathy stepped over to him and gently kissed his cheek. When Ellen saw them an hour later, they were sitting next to each other, and she had started teaching him to read. Ellen heard Cathy singing to herself when she went upstairs that night. The next day there was trouble. Everyone always ate their lunch with Mr. Heathcliff. Cathy usually sat next to Ellen, but on this day she sat next to Hareton. Heathcliff came in a moment later, and they started the meal in silence. Hareton did not dare to speak to Cathy. He hardly dared to look, and yet she started making funny faces at him. At last the two of them began to laugh. Heathcliff's eyes went from one to the other, but Cathy looked at him and was not afraid. "It's good for you that you're on the other side of the table," he said meanly. "I thought I'd made you stop laughing." "It was my fault," said Hareton quietly. Heathcliff looked at him. "What did you say?" he asked. Hareton looked at his plate and said no more. When they had almost finished eating, Joseph ran into the room. "Mr. Heathcliff, I won't live with her any more. She's just like her mother. She speaks a few nice words to our boy, Hareton here, and he forgets everything I've done for him. Now, he's pulled up some bushes I planted in the garden." "Is the old man drunk?" asked Heathcliff. "Have you done something, Hareton?" Hareton looked uncomfortable. "Well, I did pull up 2 or 3 of his bushes," he said, "but I was going to plant them again." "And why did you pull the bushes up?" Heathcliff asked.
"I asked him to do it,"
said Cathy quietly.
"We're going to plant some flowers there."
"Who told you that you could touch anything in this house?" demanded Heathcliff. "And who told you to obey her?" he added, turning to Hareton.
"You shouldn't keep me from having a few pieces of dirt when you've taken my home from me,"
yelled Cathy. "Be quiet," Heathcliff shouted.
"And you've also taken Hareton's land and money,"
she went on bravely.
"Well, he and I are friends now. If you hit me, then Hareton will hit you."
She could say nothing more because Heathcliff stood up and grabbed Cathy by the hair. Hareton jumped up and tried to help her. "Don't you hurt her, Heathcliff," he cried. Heathcliff seemed ready to tear Cathy to pieces. And then the strangest thing happened. He let go of Cathy's hair. He stared into her face. Suddenly he shivered and put a hand over his eyes. "Leave me," he said slowly. "Leave me alone, all of you." For a moment they stared at him in amazement. Then Ellen stood up and took Cathy out of the room. Hareton followed them. Cathy and Hareton spent the rest of the day having a reading lesson in the kitchen. When night came, Ellen went into Heathcliff's room. He was sitting by the fire alone. His face was dark. "Ellen," he said, "I'm changing inside. I am not interested in life. I don't care any more about Hareton and the girl. I've lost my power to hate. I can't hate them any longer."
"What do you mean?"
asked Ellen.
"Are you sorry for what you've done now? Are you afraid of death?"
"Afraid?" Heathcliff laughed coldly. "No, I want to die, Ellen. I've wanted it for so long. I have to tell myself to breathe and tell my heart to beat. Oh, God, I wish it were all over. I wish I could be with her. That's all I have ever wanted." Then he was quiet and seemed to forget that Ellen was there. She left him alone. She knew so much about him. She knew that Heathcliff's hard and unlucky life and his deep love for Catherine Earnshaw had made his life a hell. She did not know what would happen. Chapter 3. The End of It. One night, after the family was in bed, Ellen heard Heathcliff leave the house. He did not come back that night, and in the morning he was still gone. It was April then, and the weather was fine and warm. After breakfast that morning, Cathy went out to the garden. A few minutes later, she ran back into the house.
"Heathcliff's come back, Ellen. He actually spoke to me,"
she told Ellen.
"And he looked almost happy about something. But he's acting so strangely."
A minute later, Heathcliff stood at the open door.
"Will you have some breakfast?"
Ellen asked. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry, Ellen," he said. He walked into the house. "Tell Hareton and the girl to stay away from me," he said. "I want to be alone. Don't you come and speak to me either. If all of you stay away from me, everything will be all right." Ellen did not understand. He went into the inner room and shut the door. At 8:00 that night, she went into his room with a candle. He was sitting by the open window, staring out into the night. He did not seem to know that she was there.
"Mr. Heathcliff, do you want me to close the window?"
she asked him. He turned, and Ellen saw his face. She was shocked to see him, because he looked like a ghost. He had deep black eyes and a strange smile, and he was terribly pale. "All right, close the window," he said. "I'm going to my room. I won't want anything to eat till morning." She heard him go up the stairs, but he did not go to his own room. He went into the one that had been Catherine's, the first Cathy's, when she was a girl. The following night it began to rain, and it rained all night until early morning. As Ellen took her morning walk around the house, she saw that the window of the first Catherine's room was open, and the rain was coming into it. Ellen opened the door of the room and looked in carefully. Heathcliff was sitting on the bed by the window. The look on his face amazed and frightened her. He was smiling. She did not think that he was dead at first. His face and throat were wet with rain. The bedsheets were wet, but Heathcliff's body was still. When she touched his arm, she knew that he was finally dead. She shut the window, combed his long black hair, and tried to close his eyes. They would not shut. Ellen was suddenly afraid and called for Joseph. "The devil has taken his soul," he cried. "What a terrible man he is, smiling at death in that way." When Hareton was told that Heathcliff was dead, he cried and was very upset. The doctor could not tell them why Heathcliff had died. There was no good reason for it at all. They buried him where he wanted to be, close beside the body of the first Catherine. However, soon the country people were saying that Heathcliff still walked around the moors. Some said that they'd seen him near the church, or even at Wuthering Heights. He was always with Catherine Earnshaw, who had been dead for many years now. Joseph promised Ellen that he had seen the first Cathy and Heathcliff running across the moors together one night, laughing happily. They were finally together. Ellen did not believe any of these stories. People just like to believe in ghosts, she thought. And yet she did not like being out in the dark herself, and she was happy that when Cathy and Hareton were married, everyone would go and live at Thrushcross Grange. Sometimes, on a fine day, she went down to the churchyard to place flowers by Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw's graves. She also put flowers on Edgar Linton's grave, which was next to the other two. She stood there one day under the beautiful sky and watched the birds fly among the trees and flowers. She listened to the soft wind moving through the grass and wondered how anyone could ever believe that Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff were not at peace in heaven together.